Welcome to this deep dive into one of philosophy's most challenging and transformative works, Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Over the next few hours, we're going to journey together through every major section of this profound philosophical novel, unpacking its dense symbolism, exploring its revolutionary ideas, and discovering why this book continues to challenge and inspire readers more than a century after its publication. This isn't going to be a surface-level summary. We're going to spend time with the text itself, examining key passages closely, wrestling with Nietzsche's complex ideas about human potential, morality, and meaning, and understanding how each chapter builds toward his vision of human transformation. So settle in, because we're about to embark on an intellectual adventure that will demand your attention but reward your patience. Zarathustra's prologue, the descent begins. Let's begin at the very beginning, with the prologue of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This opening section is absolutely crucial because it establishes not just the setting and the main character, but the entire philosophical framework that Nietzsche will develop throughout the book. The prologue introduces us to Zarathustra himself, a prophet-like figure modeled after the ancient Persian religious teacher Zoroaster, and it presents us with the central dramatic action of the entire work, Zarathustra's descent from the mountains to share his wisdom with humanity. The book opens with these iconic lines. When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and the lake of his home and went into the mountains. There he enjoyed his spirit and his solitude, and for 10 years did not weary of it, but at last his heart changed. Now let's pause here and really think about what Nietzsche is doing with this opening. First, notice the age, 30 years old. This is the same age at which Jesus Christ began his ministry in the Christian tradition, and Nietzsche is absolutely aware of this parallel. He's deliberately invoking that religious imagery, but as we'll see, he's going to completely invert and transform it. Zarathustra spends 10 years in solitude in the mountains. That's a full decade of isolation, contemplation, and self-development. Think about what that means. This isn't someone who has just had a flash of insight or a momentary revelation. This is a person who has spent a substantial portion of his adult life in deep reflection, removed from society, from its distractions, its demands, its conventional wisdom, and during those 10 years, he doesn't grow weary of his solitude. He enjoys his spirit. There's something important here about the value of solitude, about the necessity of stepping away from the crowd, from what Nietzsche will later call the herd, in order to develop genuine wisdom and authentic insight. But then something changes. His heart changes. After a decade of wisdom gathering and spiritual development, Zarathustra experiences a transformation. He becomes, in Nietzsche's words, overfull of wisdom. This is a beautiful image. The idea that wisdom can accumulate to the point of overflowing, that enlightenment creates a pressure that demands release, that understanding generates a need to share and to teach. Zarathustra has filled his cup to the brim, and now that cup must be emptied so it can be filled again. The text continues with Zarathustra rising one morning with the rosy dawn and going before the sun to speak to it. This is our first encounter with Nietzsche's rich use of symbolism and poetic imagery. Zarathustra addresses the sun directly, saying something like, "You great star, what would your happiness be if you did not have those for whom you shine?" This is a profound metaphor for the relationship between the enlightened individual and humanity. The sun, in its greatness and brilliance, needs those below who can receive its light. Its purpose, its meaning, its very happiness depends on having recipients for its radiance. Similarly, Zarathustra, having achieved his own enlightenment, now needs others with whom he can share his wisdom. His fulfillment requires an audience, students, humanity itself. And then Zarathustra declares his intention. Lo, this cup is again going to empty itself, and Zarathustra is again going to be a man. Notice that beautiful phrase, going to be a man. During his 10 years of solitude, Zarathustra has become something more than an ordinary man. He has achieved a kind of superhuman wisdom and perspective. But now, in order to share that wisdom, he must return to human society, must re-engage with the human world, must in some sense become human again. This is the descent, the going under or down going that Nietzsche emphasizes. The German word here is crucial. Untergang can mean going down, going under, decline, or even destruction. So Zarathustra's descent is not just a physical journey down the mountain, it's a kind of self-sacrifice, a willingness to risk himself, to potentially be destroyed or diminished by his encounter with humanity. This echoes the Christian notion of divine descent and incarnation, but again, Nietzsche is transforming it. This is not a God becoming man to offer salvation through suffering. This is a wise man descending to offer humanity a completely different kind of gift, a philosophy of self-overcoming and empowerment. So Zarathustra begins his journey down from the mountains. The text tells us he goes alone, with no one meeting him at first. But when he enters the forest, something significant happens. He encounters an old hermit, a saint who lives in the woods and who had left his dwelling to search for roots. This meeting is absolutely packed with meaning. The old hermit recognizes Zarathustra. He remembers him from years ago when Zarathustra had passed this way before, heading up into the mountains. The hermit says something like, "This wanderer is no stranger to me. Many years ago he passed this way. Zarathustra was his name, but he has transformed." The hermit notices that Zarathustra has changed. He carries himself differently. His eyes are different. His whole bearing has been altered by his decade of solitude and contemplation. The two engage in a conversation, and the hermit asks Zarathustra what he's doing coming back down to the human world. Essentially, the hermit is saying, "Why would you want to go back to humanity? I've withdrawn from all that. I live here in the forest, I praise God, I sing, I laugh, I cry to God." The hermit represents the traditional religious response to the world: withdrawal, devotion to God, ascetic practice, a turning away from human society in favor of divine contemplation. But Zarathustra's response is one of the most famous passages in all of Nietzsche's work. He asks the hermit what he does in his forest solitude, and the hermit replies that he loves God, that he praises God through songs. And then Zarathustra asks a question that will reverberate throughout the entire book and throughout all of modern philosophy. And what does the saint do in the forest? The hermit explains his religious devotion, and then Zarathustra makes his departure. But as he walks away alone again, he says to himself, "Could it be possible? This old saint in the forest has not yet heard that God is dead. God is dead." These three words encapsulate one of Nietzsche's most radical and most misunderstood ideas. Let's be very clear about what Nietzsche means here, because this is foundational to everything that follows in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche is not making a theological claim about the existence or non-existence of a divine being. He's not arguing for atheism in a scientific sense. Rather, he's making a cultural and philosophical observation. The traditional framework of Christian morality and metaphysics that had structured Western civilization for nearly 2,000 years had lost its power, its credibility, its ability to provide meaning and direction for human life. For centuries, European culture had organized itself around Christian values, Christian cosmology, Christian moral frameworks. God was the foundation, the ultimate source of meaning, purpose, value, and truth. But by Nietzsche's time, in the late 19th century, the advance of science, the rise of historical criticism, the development of secular philosophy, and the general processes of modernization had eroded that foundation. Fewer and fewer people actually believed in the literal truth of Christian doctrine, and even those who still identified as Christians often lived in ways that contradicted or ignored religious teaching. The hermit in the forest represents someone who has not yet grasped this fundamental shift in Western civilization. He's still living as though the old religious framework were intact and vital, unaware that the ground has shifted beneath his feet. But Zarathustra knows. He understands that the old gods are dead, that the old certainties have crumbled, and this creates both a crisis and an opportunity. The crisis is obvious. If God is dead, if the traditional sources of meaning and morality are no longer viable, then what prevents everything from dissolving into nihilism, into meaninglessness, into chaos? If there's no God to define good and evil, no afterlife to provide ultimate justice, no divine plan to give purpose to suffering, then why should anyone do anything? Why not simply give in to despair or hedonism or destructive impulses? But the opportunity is equally significant. With the death of God comes human freedom. the freedom to create new values, to define our own meaning, to become something more than we have been. And this is precisely what Zarathustra has descended from his mountain to teach. He comes not to mourn the death of God, but to announce it boldly, and to show humanity the path forward, the path toward what Nietzsche will call the Übermensch, or Overman, the human being who has transcended the limitations and weaknesses of traditional humanity to create himself anew. The marketplace speech. Zarathustra continues his descent from the mountains and eventually arrives at a town. This is a critical moment because it marks his first encounter with ordinary humanity after his decade of isolation and enlightenment. And what does he find when he arrives? He discovers that a crowd has assembled in the marketplace, and they're waiting for something. They're waiting to see a tightrope walker perform. This detail is not incidental. The crowd has gathered not for wisdom, not for philosophy, not for spiritual transformation, but for entertainment, for spectacle, for a distraction. Already we can see Nietzsche setting up a tension between what Zarathustra has come to offer and what the people actually want. Zarathustra sees this crowd and seizes the opportunity. He begins to speak to them, and what he says constitutes one of the most important philosophical declarations in modern thought. His opening words are direct and challenging. I teach you the Overman. Mankind is something to be overcome. What have you done to overcome mankind? This is Zarathustra's central teaching, the gift he has descended from the mountain to deliver. The concept of the Übermensch, the Overman or Superman. Let's unpack this idea carefully because it's both profound and frequently misunderstood. When Nietzsche speaks of the Übermensch, he's not talking about some kind of genetic superman or a master race. That's a grotesque distortion that would later be perpetrated by Nazi ideology, which completely perverted Nietzsche's actual philosophy. Rather, the Übermensch represents a type of human being who has overcome the limitations, weaknesses, and contradictions of current humanity. It's about self-overcoming, about transcending the human, all-too-human qualities that keep us small, reactive, resentful, and dependent on external sources of meaning and value. Zarathustra tells the crowd that mankind is something to be overcome. Think about what this means. Human beings as they currently exist are not the end point of development, not the pinnacle of creation, not something to be preserved in its present form. Instead, humanity is a bridge, a transition, something to be surpassed. We are the raw material for something greater, and this is where Nietzsche radically breaks from traditional religious and philosophical thought. Christianity teaches that human beings are created in the image of God, that we have immortal souls, that our purpose is to worship and serve the divine. Secular humanism places human beings at the center of moral concern, treating human nature as something to be respected and preserved. But Nietzsche says no. Humanity itself must be overcome, must be transformed into something higher. The Übermensch, then, is the human being who has successfully navigated the crisis created by the death of God. Instead of falling into nihilism and despair when the old religious values collapse, the Übermensch creates new values, affirms life in all its difficulty and suffering, and finds meaning not in some transcendent realm but in this earthly existence. As one of the sources explains, Zarathustra emphasizes that we must remain faithful to the earth. This is crucial. Traditional religion teaches people to devalue this world, this life, this body, in favor of an imagined afterlife, a heavenly realm, a spiritual dimension. But for Nietzsche, this otherworldly orientation is a fundamental error, a denial of life, a symptom of weakness and sickness. The Übermensch rejects this otherworldly thinking and instead embraces earthly existence fully. But the crowd doesn't understand. They don't grasp what Zarathustra is trying to tell them. So Zarathustra shifts his approach. If they can't be inspired by the vision of the Übermensch, perhaps they can be motivated by fear and disgust. He introduces them to the concept of the last man. Behold, I show you the last man, Zarathustra declares. The last man represents the opposite of the Übermensch. It's the end point of decline, the final degradation of humanity, the destination humanity seems to be heading toward if it doesn't change course. And what characterizes the last man? Mediocrity, comfort-seeking, risk aversion, and absolute contentedness with a small, trivial existence. The last man asks questions like, what is love? What is creation? What is longing? These questions aren't genuine inquiries seeking understanding. They are rhetorical expressions of incomprehension. The last man has lost the capacity for greatness, for passion, for creative striving. The last man wants only comfort, security, and pleasant distractions. The last man, as Nietzsche describes through Zarathustra, is a product of mediocrity and equality. Now be careful here. Nietzsche isn't making a simple political argument against democracy or social equality. Rather, he's critiquing what he sees as a leveling tendency in modern culture, a tendency toward conformity and mediocrity, where everyone is encouraged to be the same, where differences in ability and ambition are suppressed, where excellence is viewed with suspicion, and where the highest goal becomes not greatness but comfortable survival. The last man takes no risks, knows nothing of greatness, and desires only peace and ease. In Nietzsche's chilling phrase, the souls of the last man will be dead before their bodies. Zarathustra presents this vision of the last man to the crowd, hoping that it will disgust them, hoping that fear of becoming these pitiful creatures will motivate them to strive for the Übermensch instead, but his strategy backfires spectacularly. Instead of being repulsed by the image of the last man, the crowd actually embraces it. They essentially say, "Give us this last man, O Zarathustra. Make us into these last men." They want the comfort, the safety, the pleasant mediocrity that the last man represents. This is one of the great tragic comic moments in the book. Zarathustra has come down from the mountain bearing a gift of wisdom, offering humanity a path to greatness, and humanity responds by asking him to help them become more comfortable in their mediocrity. And this is when Zarathustra realizes a crucial truth about teaching and communication. He later reflects that he made a mistake by going to the marketplace and speaking to everyone. When you speak to everyone, you speak to no one. This insight is so important that Nietzsche makes it part of the subtitle of the entire book, a book for all and none. The wisdom that Zarathustra has to offer isn't for everyone. It's not democratic in that sense. It's for those rare individuals who are willing to risk themselves, who hunger for something more than comfort and security, who can endure the difficulty and terror of creating their own values in the absence of divine guidance. As Zarathustra later says, "In the marketplace no one believes in higher men. The mob blink and say there are no higher men. We are all equal. Man is but man before God. We are all equal before God. But now this God has died." But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to the scene in the marketplace. While Zarathustra is delivering his speech about the Übermensch and the last man, something is happening that will become deeply symbolic. The tightrope walker has begun his performance. This is not a coincidence or a mere background detail. The tightrope walker becomes a living metaphor for Zarathustra's teaching. Think about what a tightrope walker does. He suspends himself high above the ground, balanced precariously between 2 points, and he moves across that dangerous space through skill, courage, and concentration. One misstep means death. This is exactly what Nietzsche believes human beings must do. We must become tightrope walkers, suspended between the animal we once were and the Übermensch we might become, crossing a dangerous abyss where one false step could mean destruction. As the tightrope walker reaches the center of the rope, something terrible happens. A jester appears at one end of the rope and begins to walk out toward the performer. This jester is a buffoonish, disruptive figure, and he mocks and taunts the tightrope walker, telling him he'd better hurry along or get out of the way. The jester represents those forces, both internal and external, that try to disrupt our careful navigation across the abyss, the voices of mockery and disruption that try to make us lose our balance. And then the jester does something shocking. He leaps over the tightrope walker with a terrible cry. The effect is immediate and catastrophic. The tightrope walker loses his balance and falls. He crashes to the ground in a broken heap. The crowd scatters in terror and confusion. But Zarathustra doesn't run. He stands his ground and goes to the fallen performer. This detail is important. While everyone else flees, Zarathustra remains and approaches the dying man. The tightrope walker is crushed, crippled, near death. And in his dying moments he asks Zarathustra a question that reveals his deepest fear. Are you the devil come to drag me to hell? Even in this moment of extremity, even at the point of death, the old religious framework asserts itself. The dying man fears divine punishment, fears that his soul will be dragged to hell for his failures. But Zarathustra's response is gentle and profound. He tells the dying man, "On mine honor, my friend, there is no devil and no hell. Thy soul will be dead even sooner than thy body. Fear, therefore, nothing any more." This is an extraordinarily compassionate moment, but it's also deeply philosophical. Zarathustra is telling the dying man the truth as Nietzsche understands it. There is no afterlife, no divine judgment, no hell, no immortal soul that survives death. When you die, you simply cease to be. And while this might seem like bad news, Zarathustra presents it as liberating. Fear, therefore, nothing anymore. If there's no hell, no punishment, no divine retribution, then what is there to fear? The tightrope walker understands. He looks at Zarathustra and says, essentially, if you speak the truth, then I lose nothing when I lose my life. I am not much more than an animal which has been taught to dance by blows and scanty fare. This is heartbreaking. The dying man recognizes that his entire life has been one of trained performance, of jumping through hoops for minimal reward, of risking his life for the entertainment of others. He has been treated like an animal, trained through violence and deprivation to perform tricks. And if there's no afterlife where he might receive compensation or justice, then his death is simply the end of a brutal, meaningless existence. But Zarathustra sees something the dying man doesn't. He tells him, "Not so. You have made danger your calling. There is nothing in that to despise. Now you perish through your calling, so I will bury you with my own hands." Zarathustra honors the tightrope walker because even if the man doesn't fully understand it himself, he has lived dangerously. He has risked himself. He has walked the tightrope suspended over the abyss, and this, for Nietzsche, is noble. This is worthy of respect. Not the cautious life of safety and security, but the dangerous life of risk and striving, even if that risk is ultimately in service of mere entertainment, even if the striving leads to death. The tightrope walker, in his way, prefigures the Übermensch more than any of the comfortable people in the crowd who scattered at the first sign of danger. When Zarathustra says this, the dying man replies no more, but he reaches out his hand to Zarathustra in thanks. He dies in Zarathustra's presence, and Zarathustra makes a promise. He will bury this man with his own hands. This is significant because later in the prologue, townspeople will refuse to help Zarathustra with the corpse. They see the dead tightrope walker as cursed, as touched by the devil, as something to be avoided. But Zarathustra takes the body himself and carries it out of the city. The three Metamorphoses. As Zarathustra carries the corpse of the tightrope walker through the town, something revealing happens. He tries to take the body to a graveyard, but the gravediggers mock him, laughing and saying he's trying to steal a soul from the devil. These townspeople see the tightrope walker's death as divine punishment, as evidence of demonic influence. They won't help Zarathustra because they believe the corpse is cursed. This tells us something crucial about the people Zarathustra is trying to reach. They're still trapped in the old religious framework, still interpreting everything through the lens of divine reward and punishment, still unable to see human life and death in purely earthly terms. As Zarathustra makes his way out of town with his burden, the jester who caused the fall suddenly appears again. This jester is a sinister figure, and he delivers a warning to Zarathustra. "Leave this town," he says. "The pious hate you, the good and the just hate you, and if you stay another day, they will kill you." The jester threatens to jump over Zarathustra himself tomorrow if he's still around. This is a chilling moment because it reveals the hostility that Zarathustra's message provokes. Those who consider themselves good, those who consider themselves pious and just, these are precisely the people who want to destroy him. Why? Because his teaching threatens their entire worldview, their entire system of values, their entire way of making sense of existence. Zarathustra continues into the wilderness with the corpse, and eventually he grows hungry. He comes upon a hut in the woods where an old man lives. This hermit offers Zarathustra bread and wine. Notice the echo of Christian communion here, and insists on feeding both Zarathustra and the corpse. There's something touching and absurd about this gesture, feeding a dead body, but it also speaks to a kind of hospitality and care that exists outside the judgmental hostility of the town. After eating, Zarathustra continues for 2 more hours until he finds a hollow tree. And here, in a detail that's both practical and deeply symbolic, he buries the tightrope walker's corpse in this hollow tree. He lays the body in the womb of the tree, returning it to nature. Then, exhausted from his ordeal, Zarathustra himself falls asleep. When he awakens the next morning, something has changed in him. Lying there, he has a crucial realization. Speaking to the masses, trying to address everyone in the marketplace, is like carrying around a corpse. It's a dead weight, a futile burden. The crowd doesn't want what he has to offer. They don't want the difficulty and responsibility of creating their own values. They don't want to become overmen. They want comfort. They want entertainment. They want to remain lost men. So Zarathustra must change his approach entirely. He says to himself, I need companions, living ones, not dead companions and corpses which I carry with me wherever I want. He needs to find living companions, disciples, people who are genuinely ready to hear his teaching and to undertake the difficult work of self-overcoming. This is a pivotal moment in the book's structure. Zarathustra realizes he must not be a shepherd leading a herd, but rather someone who lures individuals away from the herd. He's not going to lead the masses to salvation or enlightenment. Instead, he's going to call out to those rare individuals who have the ears to hear, who have the courage to leave the safety of the crowd and venture into dangerous territory. The book's subtitle, A Book for All and None, makes perfect sense now. It's written for everyone in the sense that anyone can read it, but it's for no one in the sense that most people will reject it, mock it, or misunderstand it completely. It's truly only for those who are ready, those who are already seeking what Zarathustra has to offer. And this is where the prologue ends. Zarathustra has descended from the mountain. He has delivered his message to the marketplace and been rejected. He has honored the fallen tightrope walker, and he has realized what his true task must be: to find companions, to gather disciples, to address not the many, but the few. The prologue, in a sense, is the story of Zarathustra's first failure and his subsequent recalibration. It sets up everything that follows, the teachings he will share with his disciples, the journey of transformation he will guide them through, and the philosophy of life affirmation and self-overcoming that will be developed in depth throughout the book's 4 parts. Part 1, on the 3 Metamorphoses. Now we move into Part 1 proper, and Zarathustra begins his actual teaching. The first chapter is titled On the 3 Metamorphoses, and it's absolutely foundational to understanding Nietzsche's vision of human development and transformation. Zarathustra has gathered companions by this point, people who have chosen to follow him and learn from him, and he begins to explain to them the process by which the spirit transforms itself, the stages one must pass through on the path toward becoming the Overman. Zarathustra announces, 3 metamorphoses of the spirit do I designate to you, how the spirit becometh a camel, and the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. These 3 stages, camel, lion, child, represent a developmental sequence, a necessary progression that the spirit must undergo. Let's examine each stage carefully. The first metamorphosis is the spirit becoming a camel. What does this mean? The camel is a beast of burden. It's strong, it's capable of carrying heavy loads across harsh terrain. It's patient and enduring. When Zarathustra speaks of the spirit becoming a camel, he's describing a stage of discipline, obedience, and self-denial. The camel spirit asks, what is the heaviest thing, you heroes? What is most difficult? And then it takes on that heavy burden willingly. This stage is characterized by renunciation, by accepting difficulties, by subjecting oneself to hardships for the sake of becoming stronger. Zarathustra asks, what is heavy? And he provides examples. Is it to abase yourself to make your pride suffer? Is it to cause your folly to shine out in order to mock your wisdom? Is it to part from our cause when it celebrates victory? Is it to climb high mountains to tempt the tempter? All these represent forms of self-discipline, self-denial, self-testing. The camel stage requires bearing heavy burdens of duty, tradition, religious and moral obligations, and all the thou shalts that society and culture impose upon us. Why is this stage necessary? Because strength comes from discipline. You cannot become free, cannot become creative, cannot become an overman if you've never learnt endurance, never developed the capacity to carry weight, never proven yourself capable of sustaining difficulty. The camel stage is about building strength through burden bearing. It's about accepting limitations and obligations, taking on responsibilities, submitting to discipline and training. Think about it in terms of any skill or craft. Before you can innovate, before you can create something genuinely new, you must first master the fundamentals, must learn the rules, must put in the hours of disciplined practice. The camel stage is the apprenticeship of the spirit. But the camel stage is not the end point. If you remain forever a camel, you're simply a beast of burden, carrying weights that others have placed upon you, following paths that others have laid out. You've developed strength, yes, but you haven't yet developed freedom. And so the second metamorphosis must occur. The camel must become a lion. The lion represents rebellion, independence, and self-assertion. If the camel says, I shall, accepting burdens and duties, the lion says, I will not. The lion refuses, rejects, battles. Zarathustra tells us that in the loneliest wilderness, the second metamorphosis happens. The spirit becomes a lion who wants to capture freedom and be master in its own wilderness. The lion must fight the great dragon whose name is Thou Shalt. This dragon represents all the accumulated values, all the traditional morality, all the external commandments that have been imposed from outside. On every scale of the dragon there glitters a golden Thou Shalt, thousands and thousands of obligations, rules, duties, values that have been created over centuries and presented as absolute, eternal, necessary. The dragon says, all values have already been created, and all created value is in me. Verily, there shall be no more I will. In other words, the dragon of traditional morality claims that all values have already been established, that there's no room for individual will, that the task of each person is simply to obey the existing values, not to create new ones. But the lion spirit cannot accept this. It must fight. It must say no to these external commands, must reject the authority of traditional values, must clear a space for its own freedom. This is the stage of critical thought, of questioning, of throwing off the chains of convention and inherited belief. The lion creates freedom for itself, creates a sacred no in opposition to all duty. However, and this is crucial, the lion cannot create new values. The lion can only destroy, can only negate, can only clear the ground. It can fight the dragon and win its freedom, but it cannot yet build something new in place of what it has destroyed. For that, a third metamorphosis is necessary. The lion must become a child. The child represents innocence, forgetting, a new beginning, a first movement, a sacred yes. Why does the spirit need to become a child? To create new values. Because a child has not yet been corrupted by cynicism, has not yet been weighted down by history and tradition, approaches the world with fresh eyes and genuine curiosity. The child represents what Nietzsche calls innocence and forgetting, the ability to start fresh, to engage with the world without the burden of accumulated resentments and prejudices, to play and create without self-consciousness. The child can create new values precisely because it isn't trapped by the old ones. It doesn't carry the heavy burdens of the camel anymore, and it has moved beyond the destructive negation of the lion. Instead, the child affirms, creates, plays. This is the stage of genuine creativity, of spontaneous action, of life affirmation. The child can say yes to existence, can create new meaning and value out of its own overflowing vitality. These three metamorphoses give us a roadmap for understanding what Nietzsche means by self-overcoming and the path toward the Overman. First comes discipline and endurance. the development of strength through bearing burdens. Then comes liberation, the rejection of external authority and the claiming of one's own freedom. Finally comes creation, the spontaneous generation of new values, new meaning, new ways of being. You cannot skip stages. You cannot become a creative child spirit without first being a disciplined camel spirit and a rebellious lion spirit. Each stage is necessary and each prepares for the next. This chapter sets the philosophical framework for everything that follows in part 1. Zarathustra will now proceed to elaborate on specific aspects of his teaching, specific critiques of contemporary culture, specific visions of how human beings might transform themselves. But the 3 Metamorphoses provide the underlying structure, the developmental logic that makes sense of the various individual teachings. After establishing the framework of the 3 Metamorphoses, Zarathustra proceeds to address specific topics, specific errors in thinking, and specific cultural pathologies that prevent human beings from achieving transformation. The chapters that follow in part 1 are interconnected critiques of traditional religious and philosophical attitudes that Nietzsche believes have poisoned Western culture and held humanity back from its potential. On the afterworldly, one of Zarathustra's most direct attacks on traditional religion comes in the chapter on the afterworldly. Here, Zarathustra confronts those who create fantasies of other worlds, heavenly realms, spiritual dimensions, anything that devalues this earthly existence in favor of some imagined transcendent reality. The afterworldly are those people who cannot bear the difficulties and sufferings of earthly life, and so they invent consoling fictions about worlds beyond this one. Zarathustra explains that in the past, when he was young, he too believed in such afterworlds. He thought there must be something beyond this painful, confusing, imperfect material existence, but he came to realize that these afterworlds were created by human suffering itself. When people are sick, when they're dissatisfied, when they cannot find meaning or purpose in this life, they imagine that their true essence is spirit rather than body, and they create gods and afterlives as distractions from present pain. Think about what Nietzsche is arguing here. Traditional religion, particularly Christianity, teaches that this earthly life is temporary, that our bodies are mere vessels for immortal souls, that true happiness awaits us in heaven after death. This framework, Nietzsche believes, is born from weakness and suffering. It's a coping mechanism, a way of dealing with the unbearable difficulty of existence by imagining that this life doesn't really matter, that the real reward comes later. The text indicates that those who are sick and dying despise the body and the earth, and they invented heavenly things to escape from bodily reality. But Zarathustra teaches a new will, the will to desire the path that the sick and dying have avoided. Instead of fleeing from earthly existence, instead of devaluing the body and this world, we should embrace them, affirm them, remain faithful to the earth. This is one of Zarathustra's constant refrains throughout the book. Remain faithful to the earth. Don't allow yourselves to be seduced by promises of heavenly rewards or spiritual realms. This life, this body, this earth. These are what we have and these are what we must affirm. The psychological insight here is profound. Nietzsche understands that otherworldly thinking is often a symptom of existential despair. When life becomes unbearable, when suffering seems meaningless, the human mind seeks escape through fantasy. But this escape comes at a terrible cost. It requires devaluing the only existence we actually have. It turns this life into a mere waiting room, a test, a trial to be endured, rather than an experience to be fully lived. And in doing so, it diminishes human potential. Because if this life doesn't really matter, why would anyone strive for greatness here and now? Why would anyone seek to overcome themselves, to create, to build, to achieve, if the real rewards exist in some other realm entirely? On the despisers of the body, this critique continues and deepens in the next chapter, on the despisers of the body. Here, Zarathustra addresses directly those people who believe that the spirit or soul is the true self, and that the body is merely an inferior vessel or even a prison. This is a common theme in many religious and philosophical traditions. The idea that we are essentially spiritual beings temporarily trapped in material bodies, and that enlightenment or salvation involves freeing the spirit from bodily constraints. But Zarathustra completely rejects this dualism. He declares, "Body am I entirely and nothing more, and soul is only the name of something in the body." This is a radical statement of materialism and embodied existence. There is no separate soul or spirit that exists independently of the body. What we call soul or spirit is actually just a function of the body, an activity of bodily processes. The body is not a prison for the spirit. Rather, the body is all we are, and what we experience as consciousness, thought, and spirit emerges from bodily existence. Zarathustra goes further. He calls the body a big sagacity, a great wisdom. The body, he says, is a plurality with one sense, a war and a peace, a flock and a shepherd. Think about this description. The body is not a simple thing. It's a multiplicity, a complex system of organs, processes, drives, and functions that somehow coordinate to produce a unified organism. There's conflict within the body, different drives pulling in different directions. But there's also unity, an organizing principle that holds everything together. And here's the key point. What we call ego or I, our conscious sense of self, is actually subordinate to this larger bodily wisdom. Zarathustra says that our little reason, our conscious spirit, is merely an instrument and plaything of the body's greater sagacity. The conscious ego thinks it's in control, thinks it's making decisions and directing the organism, but actually the body is running the show. The ego says I, and is proud of that word. But the greater thing is thy body with its big sagacity. It saith not I, but doeth it. This anticipates many insights that would later emerge in psychology and neuroscience. We now know that much of what drives human behavior happens beneath the level of conscious awareness, that our rational mind often confabulates explanations for decisions that were actually made by unconscious processes, that the body's needs and drives shape our thoughts and choices in ways we don't recognize. Nietzsche, through Zarathustra, is saying something similar. The conscious I is not the master of the house, but rather a spokesperson for deeper bodily processes. So who are the despisers of the body? They are people whose bodies have become sick, weak, or incapable of creative action. The text explains that their self, that deeper bodily wisdom, wants to die and turns away from life. These people can no longer create beyond themselves, can no longer generate new possibilities, and so they seek escape in the fantasy that they are really pure spirit, that the body doesn't matter, that some other realm beyond this material existence is what truly counts. Zarathustra tells them, "Even in your folly and contempt you each serve yourself, you despisers of the body." What he means is that even their denial of the body is itself a bodily phenomenon, a symptom of bodily decline. Their philosophy of body hatred emerges from their failing bodies. The creative self that could once build beyond itself now wishes to succumb, and that's why they've become body despisers. It's all projection, all denial, all a refusal to face the truth that they are body through and through, that their spiritual crisis is actually a bodily crisis, on joys and passions. In On Joys and Passions, Zarathustra continues developing his positive vision of human nature. If the previous chapters have been primarily critical, attacking otherworldly thinking and body denial, this chapter offers something more constructive. It's about transforming our understanding of virtue, passion, and moral goodness. Zarathustra addresses what he calls the lonely ones, telling them that their virtue is unique to them, that it should not be bound by conventional moral names and categories. He says, "Let thy virtue be too high for the familiarity of names, and if thou must speak of it, be not ashamed to stammer about it." This is a beautiful idea, that genuine virtue is so individual, so particular to each person's nature and circumstances, that it resists easy categorization. You shouldn't be able to simply point to your virtue and say, "I am just" or "I am kind," as if these were standardized moral qualities that you've successfully acquired. True virtue is more personal, more idiosyncratic than that. And here's the radical part. Zarathustra insists that virtues grow out of passions. Once you had passions and called them evil, he says, but now you have only your virtues, and they grew out of those very passions. Traditional morality tends to oppose passion and virtue. Passion is seen as dangerous, unruly, something to be suppressed or controlled, while virtue is seen as rational, disciplined, opposed to passionate excess. But Zarathustra turns this on its head. Your virtues, he says, emerged from your passions. You took your strongest drives, even those that seemed destructive or dangerous, and you channeled them, transformed them, elevated them into virtues. He gives examples. Whether you were hot-tempered, or voluptuous, or fanatical, or vindictive, all your passions eventually became virtues and joys. Your anger became righteous indignation. Your lustfulness became passionate love. Your fanaticism became dedication to a cause. Your vindictiveness became commitment to justice. The raw material of vice became the substance of virtue, not through suppression, but through transformation and sublimation. This is a crucial insight into Nietzsche's moral psychology. He doesn't believe in simply eliminating or denying our darker impulses and stronger drives. That would be another form of body hatred, another attempt to deny what we actually are. Instead, we should take those powerful energies and redirect them toward creative, life-affirming purposes. The aggressive drive that might lead to violence can be channeled into competitive excellence. The sexual energy that might lead to mere hedonism can be transformed into creative productivity. The power-seeking that might lead to tyranny can become the drive for self-mastery and personal achievement. But then Zarathustra introduces a complication. He says it's better to have one virtue than many. Why? Because having many virtues means having many competing drives within yourself, and they will war with each other. Each virtue, he says, is covetous and wants the highest place. Each virtue wants your whole spirit to serve it. So if you have multiple virtues, if you're trying to be simultaneously just and kind and courageous and wise and temperate, these different values will inevitably come into conflict. There will be situations where justice demands severity but kindness demands mercy, where courage demands action but wisdom demands restraint. Your virtues will battle within you, and you'll become a battlefield of virtues. Zarathustra asks, "My brother, are war and battle evil?" And he answers, "Necessary, however, is the evil. Necessary are the envy and the distrust and the backbiting among the virtues. Internal conflict is inevitable and even necessary. The struggle between competing goods, competing values, competing drives. This is part of what makes us human and what makes growth possible. But it's a hard lot. Many people have gone into the wilderness and destroyed themselves because they were weary of being the battle and battlefield of virtues." The chapter concludes with a reminder, "Man is something that hath to be surpassed, and therefore shalt thou love thy virtues, for thou wilt succumb by them." This is both inspiring and ominous. Love your virtues because they represent your highest aspirations, your greatest strengths, but know that you will ultimately succumb by them. They will eventually exhaust you, pull you in too many directions, demand more than you can give. This is part of the process of self-overcoming. You must develop virtues, must cultivate your passions into higher forms, must strive. But you must also know that this striving will break you, will push you beyond your current limits, will force you to either transcend yourself or collapse. And that's exactly the point. On the Pale Criminal. The chapter, On the Pale Criminal, presents one of Zarathustra's most psychologically penetrating analyses. It's about a murderer, but more fundamentally, it's about self-deception, internal conflict, and the tragedy of acting against one's own nature. Zarathustra describes a criminal who has committed murder. The man's soul wanted blood. It thirsted for the happiness of the knife. There was something in his deeper nature, some drive or impulse that desired to kill. But his weak reason couldn't accept this about himself. His conscious mind, his ego, couldn't acknowledge this murderous desire, so it engaged in self-deception. His reason persuaded him, "What matter about blood? Wishest thou not at least to make booty thereby, or take revenge?" In other words, his rational mind created acceptable justifications for the killing. He was robbing someone, or he was taking revenge for some wrong. These are comprehensible motives, even if they're criminal, but they weren't the real motive. The real motive was simpler and darker. He wanted to kill. He wanted blood. He wanted the experience of taking a life. But he couldn't admit this to himself. So he committed what Zarathustra calls a murder theft. A murder disguised as theft. A killing performed for reasons the killer couldn't honestly acknowledge. And what happens afterward? The man is racked with guilt, crushed by what he's done. Even though he was perfectly capable of murder, he had the strength and the will to do it. He's now repelled by his own action. Why? Because he acted in contradiction to his self-image, his understanding of who he is. His weak reason had talked him into a false motivation, and now he must confront the truth about what he really did and why he did it. Zarathustra's judgment is striking. His crime is not so much that he murdered, but that he was driven to it by his weakness and was subsequently racked with guilt. The problem isn't the act itself so much as the self-deception, the weakness of mind that couldn't face its own impulses honestly. A stronger person would have either acknowledged the murderous desire and not acted on it, or would have owned the act completely without false justifications or subsequent guilt. This is vintage Nietzsche, finding the real moral problem not where conventional morality locates it. Conventional morality says murder is wrong, period. But Zarathustra digs deeper, examining the psychology of the murderer and finding that the real sickness is the split within the person, the war between what he truly desires and what he can consciously acknowledge about himself. On Reading and Writing. In the chapter On Reading and Writing, Zarathustra delivers a series of powerful aphoristic statements about the nature of authentic writing and thinking. This is one of the most quoted sections of the entire book, and it reveals something important about Nietzsche's own approach to philosophy and communication. Zarathustra begins with a striking declaration. Of all that is written, I love only what a man has written with his blood. Write with blood, and you will experience that blood is spirit. What does it mean to write with blood? Clearly, Nietzsche isn't speaking literally about using blood as ink. Rather, he's talking about writing that comes from one's deepest experience, writing that costs something, writing that emerges from struggle and suffering and lived reality rather than abstract theorizing. When you write with blood, you're putting your whole self into the words. You're writing from the core of your being, from your passions and your pain, from what you've actually experienced and endured. This kind of writing is transformative both for the writer and for the reader. As Zarathustra says, when you write with blood, you will experience that blood is spirit. The physical, the material, the embodied experience becomes transformed into thought, into meaning, into spirit. But it never loses its connection to that bodily origin. Remember, Zarathustra has already told us that soul is just a name for something in the body. So blood is spirit means that genuine thought, genuine wisdom, genuine philosophy emerges directly from lived experience, from the body, from life itself. But Zarathustra also says something challenging. It is not easily possible to understand the blood of another. I hate the reading idlers. If someone has truly written with their blood, if their words emerge from deep personal experience and hard-won insight, then those words cannot be casually consumed. You can't just skim them while scrolling through your phone, can't just passively absorb them without effort. Understanding foreign blood, understanding another person's blood writing, requires work, requires engagement, requires bringing your own experience and thought to meet theirs. This is why Zarathustra says, whoever writes in blood and aphorisms does not want to be read, but to be learned by heart. The goal isn't to have your words quickly read and then forgotten. The goal is for those words to become part of the reader, to be memorized, internalized, lived with over time until they transform the reader's own thinking and being. Blood writing demands blood reading. It demands that the reader invest themselves, struggle with the text, make it their own. Zarathustra then offers a beautiful metaphor. In the mountains, the shortest way is from peak to peak, but for that you must have long legs. Aphorisms are like mountain peaks, he says. Each aphorism is a summit of thought, a concentrated insight, and the path from one peak to another is short. If you have long legs, if you're capable of making the leap, But if you don't have those long legs, if you lack the preparation, the experience, the intellectual capacity, then you need all the valleys and paths in between explained to you. The aphoristic style is for those who can make the leaps, who can see the connections between concentrated insights without needing every step spelled out. This explains Nietzsche's own writing style, which is highly aphoristic, compressed, demanding. He's not trying to be obscure for obscurity's sake. Rather, he's writing for readers who are ready, who have the long legs to traverse the mountain peaks of thought. And he acknowledges that this will exclude many readers, that many will find his writing incomprehensible or irritating. But that's intentional. His philosophy is not for everyone, and neither is this book. It's for all and none. Anyone can read it, but only a few will truly understand it. The chapter continues with more aphorisms about courage, war, laughter, and dancing, but the core insight remains. Authentic philosophy must emerge from lived experience, must be written with one's blood, and must be met by readers who are willing to engage with equal intensity. Anything less is just idle consumption, and Zarathustra has contempt for that. On War and Warriors. The chapter on War and Warriors might seem shocking to modern sensibilities because Zarathustra appears to be celebrating warfare and violence. But we need to understand what Nietzsche actually means by war and warrior in this context. He's not advocating for literal military conflict or physical violence. Rather, he's using war as a metaphor for struggle, challenge, opposition, and agonistic engagement with life. Zarathustra tells his brothers that they should love peace only as a means to new wars, and that they should love the short peace more than the long. This sounds militaristic, but think about what he's really saying. Peace, comfort, safety. These are not ends in themselves. They're only valuable as preparation for the next challenge, the next struggle. If you rest too long, if you become too comfortable, you lose your edge, you become soft, you stop growing. The short peace is just long enough to recover and prepare, but not so long that you settle into complacency. The warrior that Zarathustra celebrates is not someone who fights physical battles against external enemies. Rather, the warrior fights against internal weakness, fights for personal growth, fights to overcome obstacles and limitations. When Zarathustra says, "You should love your enemy," he doesn't mean you should love those who hate you in a Christian sense of turning the other cheek. Rather, he means you should value challenge, should welcome opposition, because it's through struggling against resistance that you become stronger. The warrior ethos that Nietzsche celebrates is about courage, about facing difficulty without flinching, about not seeking the easy path. It's about being willing to risk yourself, to put yourself in situations where you might fail, where you might be wounded, where you might be destroyed. Because that's how growth happens. The warrior doesn't seek safety above all else. The warrior seeks worthy challenges, seeks to test himself against the hardest opponents, seeks to discover what he's truly capable of. There's also a critique here of certain kinds of scholarship and intellectual work. Zarathustra says that he doesn't want to be confused with scholars who sit comfortably in their studies, protected from life's dangers, analyzing and theorizing without ever putting themselves at risk. The true warrior philosopher engages with life directly, thinks dangerously, advances ideas that might destroy his reputation or his career or his peace of mind. He doesn't play it safe. He doesn't pursue knowledge as a comfortable academic exercise. He pursues truth even when it's painful, even when it's dangerous, even when it might destroy him. On the New Idol. On the New Idol is one of Zarathustra's most politically charged chapters, and the new idol is the state. Remember that Zarathustra has already announced the death of God. The old idol, the supreme object of worship and obedience, was the divine. But now that God is dead, a new idol has taken his place, and that idol is the modern state. Zarathustra opens with one of the most famous lines in political philosophy. A state? What is that? Well then, now open your ears to me, for now I shall speak to you about the death of peoples. State is the name of the coldest of all cold monsters. Coldly it lies, and this lie creeps from its mouth. I, the state, am the people. This is a devastating critique. The state claims to represent the people, claims to be the people's voice, the people's will made manifest. But this is a lie. The state is not the people. The state is an entity unto itself, a cold monster that consumes actual human communities and replaces them with bureaucratic structures and abstract citizenship. Think about what Nietzsche is getting at here. There's a difference between peoples, organic communities with shared cultures, values, and histories, and the state, which is an administrative apparatus, a legal fiction, a mechanism of control. The state didn't emerge from peoples, rather states create peoples in their own image, transforming diverse human communities into uniform citizens. The state homogenizes, standardizes, levels. It destroys the particularity and distinctiveness of actual human communities in favor of abstract equality before the law. Zarathustra says, whatever the state speaks, it lies. Whatever it has stolen. Everything about the state is false. It pretends to serve the people when really it serves its own perpetuation and expansion. It claims to embody justice when really it enforces the interests of those in power. It speaks in the language of good and evil, but it corrupts that language, using moral terms as tools of manipulation. And here's a crucial point. The state was created for the superfluous ones, for the too many. Nietzsche believes that modernity has produced vast numbers of mediocre people, people without purpose or distinction, people who cannot stand on their own, who cannot create their own meaning or direction. And the state welcomes these people, swallows them up, gives them a false sense of identity and purpose. It tells them, on earth there is nothing greater than I. It is I who am the regulating finger of God. The state becomes a substitute for God, offering the same promises, protection, meaning, guidance, salvation, and demanding the same submission. But Zarathustra warns against this idol. Where the state begins, he says, there ends the genuine human being. The state produces conformity, obedience, mediocrity. It encourages people to surrender their individuality, their potential for greatness, in exchange for security and belonging. It turns everyone into functionaries, into cogs in a machine. And most dangerously, it makes people believe that this surrender is noble, that service to the state is the highest form of virtue. Zarathustra's advice is direct. Flee to where the state ends. Go to the edges, to the margins, to places where the state's power is weakest. Only there can you find the space to become something more than a citizen, more than a subject, more than another interchangeable unit in the state's machinery. Only there can you discover what you might become if you weren't constantly shaped and constrained by institutional power. This critique has remarkable contemporary relevance. We live in an age of expanding state power, of increasing surveillance and regulation, of growing bureaucratic control over more and more aspects of human life. We're told this is for our safety, for our benefit, for the common good. But Nietzsche, through Zarathustra, asks us to question this. What are we giving up? What possibilities are being foreclosed? What kinds of human excellence are being suppressed or prevented by the state's leveling influence? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're questions worth asking. It's important to note that Nietzsche isn't offering a simple political program here. He's not arguing for anarchism or libertarianism in any conventional sense. His critique of the state is part of his larger critique of all structures and systems that prevent individual self-overcoming and the emergence of higher types of human being. The state is just one particularly powerful example of such a structure. But churches, moral systems, social conventions, economic arrangements, all of these can function as idols that demand submission and prevent transformation. What Zarathustra wants is not a different political system, but a different kind of human being. Someone who doesn't need the state to provide meaning and purpose. Someone who can create their own values. Someone who can stand alone without requiring the support structure of collective identity and institutional power. This is part of what the Übermensch represents. A human being who has overcome the need for these external supports, who has become strong enough to exist without idols, on love of the neighbor. Zarathustra now turns to one of Christianity's most celebrated virtues, love of one's neighbor, and in characteristic fashion, he completely inverts the conventional understanding of this virtue. Where Christianity teaches that loving your neighbor is the highest form of moral goodness, Zarathustra argues that neighbor love is actually a symptom of self-hatred and weakness. He begins bluntly, "You crowd around your neighbor and have fine words for it, but I say unto you, Your neighbor love is your bad love of yourselves. What does this mean? Zarathustra is saying that when people enthusiastically embrace neighbor love, when they rush to help others and celebrate their selflessness, they're often fleeing from themselves. They cannot endure being alone with themselves. They do not love themselves enough, and so they seek validation and distraction in relationships with their neighbors. Think about this psychologically. Someone who genuinely loves themselves, who has achieved a degree of self-mastery and self-acceptance, doesn't desperately need the approval or affection of others. They can be alone without discomfort. They can pursue their own goals without constantly seeking external validation. But someone who lacks self-love, who is uncomfortable with their own company, who finds solitude imprisoning, such a person will crowd toward others, will seek to lose themselves in relationships, will try to mislead your neighbor into love, and would fain gild yourselves with his error. Zarathustra makes a devastating observation. You flee unto your neighbor from yourselves, and would fain make a virtue thereof. In other words, what appears as moral goodness, this selfless concern for others, is actually escapism dressed up as virtue. The person who constantly sacrifices for their neighbor isn't noble. They're avoiding the difficult work of confronting and transforming themselves. There's another dimension to Zarathustra's critique. He says, one man goes to his neighbor because he seeks himself, and another because he would lose himself. Some people seek their neighbors because they're looking for affirmation, for a mirror that will reflect back a flattering image of themselves. Others seek their neighbors because they want to dissolve into the crowd, to lose their individuality, to escape the burden of being a distinct self. Either way, it's not genuine love or genuine connection. It's need, it's weakness, it's self-deception. And there's a moral problem here too. Zarathustra says, the furthest ones are they who pay for your love to the near ones, and when there are but 5 of you together, a 6th must always die. What does this mean? When you focus all your energy and care on those immediately around you, your family, your neighbors, your local community, you necessarily neglect those who are further away, both spatially and temporally. You neglect humanity as a whole. You neglect future generations. You neglect the grand possibilities of human transformation. Your parochial concern for the near ones comes at the expense of what Zarathustra really values. Concern for the Overman. Concern for humanity's potential to transcend itself. So instead of neighbor love, Zarathustra teaches what he calls furthest love, or love of the distant. Rather than focusing on the people immediately around you, focus on the far-off goal of human transformation. Rather than spending yourself on maintaining and comforting those who already exist, invest yourself in bringing forth something higher, something that doesn't yet exist but might exist in the future. This is the love that creates, that builds, that transforms, rather than the love that merely comforts and maintains. On the friend, having criticized neighbor love, Zarathustra presents an alternative. Genuine friendship. He says, I teach you the friend in whom the world standeth complete, a capsule of the good, the creating friend, who hath always a complete world to bestow. This is a radically different vision of relationship than neighbor love. The friend, as Zarathustra conceives him, is not someone you flee to in order to escape yourself. The friend is not someone you use for validation or comfort. Rather, the friend is someone who embodies a complete world, who has achieved a degree of wholeness and self-sufficiency, and who can give to you from that fullness. The friend has what Zarathustra elsewhere calls bestowing virtue, an overflowing abundance that naturally gives itself. Think about the difference between this and the needy relationships that Zarathustra criticizes. In needy relationships, each person is trying to get something from the other: validation, comfort, distraction, a sense of purpose. Each person is incomplete and looking to the other to fill that incompleteness. But in genuine friendship, both people come to the relationship from a position of strength and abundance. They don't need each other in a desperate sense. Rather, they choose each other, they celebrate each other, they give to each other from their overflow. The creating friend hath always a complete world to bestow. This is beautiful. A true friend doesn't just offer bits and pieces of themselves, doesn't just provide occasional help or support. Rather, the friend offers an entire perspective, an entire way of being in the world, an entire cosmos of meaning and value. When you're with a genuine friend, you enter into their world, and as the world unrolled itself for him, so rolleth it together again for him in rings, as the growth of good through evil, as the growth of purpose out of chance. The friend shows you how their experience has meaning, how they've transformed suffering into growth, how they've found purpose in contingency. This is why friendship for Nietzsche is such a high ideal. It's not about casual companionship or pleasant social interaction. It's about two sovereign individuals who have each achieved something valuable in themselves and who can recognize and honor that achievement in each other. It's about mutual respect between equals, not about one person supporting another's weakness. On marriage and children. Zarathustra's teaching on marriage and children is equally challenging to conventional morality. He begins with a question: have you the victory over yourselves? Are you a victorious man, one who hath subdued himself, one who ruleth his senses and is master of his virtues? Only if you can answer yes to these questions, only if you've achieved substantial self-mastery, should you even consider having children. Why this requirement? Because Zarathustra sees children not as mere biological reproduction, not as a social obligation or a source of personal fulfillment, but as living monuments to one's victory and liberation. You create a child in order to build something beyond yourself, in order to give form to your highest aspirations, in order to create a being who might surpass you. But you cannot build beyond yourself if you have not first built yourself. You cannot give your child the gifts of self-mastery, discipline, and creative power if you do not possess these yourself. This is radically different from how most people think about parenthood. Most people have children for all sorts of reasons, because it's expected, because they want to be loved, because they're lonely, because they think it will give their lives meaning, because of social pressure, or simply because of biological accident. But Zarathustra says this is wrong. These are the wrong reasons, and they produce the wrong kind of children. These are what he calls the superfluous, the many too many, people without purpose or greatness who reproduce themselves endlessly. Zarathustra defines marriage accordingly. Marriage I call the will of two to create the one that is more than those who created it. Marriage should be a union devoted to creating something higher than either partner, devoted to bringing forth a child who represents the best possibilities of both parents. This requires reverence, requires shared purpose, requires both partners to be committed not just to each other, but to this higher creative goal. But what does Zarathustra observe instead? He sees marriages characterized by spiritual poverty, by mutual contamination, by contentment with mediocrity. He sees people who claim their marriages are blessed by God, but who actually have no higher purpose, no creative aspiration, nothing that elevates their union beyond mere companionship or sexual satisfaction. These marriages produce more of the superfluous, more mediocre people who will live conventional lives and never attempt anything great. The critic here is harsh, but it's consistent with Nietzsche's overall philosophy. If humanity is something to be overcome, if the goal is the Overman, then every decision, including the decision to marry and have children, should be evaluated in terms of whether it advances or hinders that goal. Marriages and children that simply reproduce mediocrity, that bring forth more last men, are not just neutral, they're actively harmful to humanity's potential transformation. On the bestowing virtue. Part 1 concludes with one of its most important chapters, on the bestowing virtue. This chapter presents Zarathustra's positive vision of what virtue should be, in contrast to all his various critiques of conventional morality. And the key concept here is bestowing, giving, overflowing abundance. Zarathustra tells his disciples, "When your heart overfloweth broad and full like the river, a blessing and a danger to the lowlanders, there is the origin of your virtue." Virtue doesn't come from following rules, from restraining yourself, from dutifully performing obligations. Rather, virtue emerges from abundance, from having so much strength and vitality and creative power that it naturally overflows and gives itself. Like a river that's so full it floods its banks, the virtuous person is so full of life and meaning that they cannot help but give, cannot help but bestow, cannot help but pour themselves out. This is the bestowing virtue, and Zarathustra says it's the highest virtue. It's uncommon, it's unprofitable, meaning it doesn't calculate returns on investment, and it's characterized by giving rather than taking. The person with bestowing virtue doesn't help others because it makes them feel good about themselves, doesn't give because they expect gratitude or reward. They give because they must, because they're overflowing, because abundance demands expression. Zarathustra contrasts this with what he calls sickly selfishness, the selfishness of those who are poor and hungry in spirit, who always want to take and steal because they lack inner resources. This is the selfishness of weakness, the grasping quality of those who feel they don't have enough and must therefore extract from others. But there's another kind of selfishness, what Zarathustra calls healthy and holy selfishness, which is the selfishness of abundance. This is the selfishness of someone who is so full, so rich in spirit, that their self-interest naturally includes giving to others, includes creating beauty and value that radiates outward. He describes the origins of this bestowing virtue in a series of powerful images. When ye are exalted above praise and blame, and your will would command all things, as a loving one's will, there is the origin of your virtue. When you've moved beyond caring what others think, beyond seeking approval or fearing condemnation, and when your will is strong enough to command all things, not as a tyrant commands through violence, but as a lover commands through attraction and inspiration, then you found the source of genuine virtue. When ye despise pleasant things and the effeminate couch, and cannot couch far enough from the effeminate, there is the origin of your virtue. When you've developed such strength and such appetite for challenge that comfort seems contemptible, that ease seems like weakness, that you actively seek difficulty and hardship, this too is the origin of virtue. Not comfort-seeking, not pleasure maximization, but the embrace of difficulty as the path to growth. When ye are wilers of one will, and when that change of every need is needful to you, there is the origin of your virtue. When you've achieved such unity of purpose, such integration of all your drives and desires around a single great goal, that even your needs change to align with that goal, this is virtue, not fragmentation, not inner conflict, not being pulled in multiple directions, but wholeness, unity, singularity of purpose. Zarathustra describes this new virtue as power, as a ruling thought, with a subtle soul around it, as a golden sun, with the serpent of knowledge around it. This is a rich symbol. The golden sun represents the radiant, life-giving, abundant quality of the bestowing virtue. The serpent of knowledge represents wisdom, but also something potentially dangerous, something that can bite. True virtue combines radiant abundance with sharp intelligence, combines giving with knowing, combines love with understanding. And crucially, Zarathustra tells his disciples, "Remain true to the earth, my brethren, with the power of your virtue. Let your bestowing love and your knowledge be devoted to be the meaning of the earth. Whatever virtue you develop, whatever values you create, whatever meaning you discover or invent, all of this must remain earthly, must remain focused on this life, this world, this material existence. Don't let your virtue become an excuse for otherworldly thinking. Don't let your love become an escape into spiritual abstractions. Remain faithful to the earth, always." Part 2. The Child with the Mirror, Blessed Isles, and the Pitying. Part 2 of Thus Spoke Zarathustra begins with Zarathustra returning to his mountain solitude after years spent teaching among people. He has shared his wisdom with his disciples, and now he returns to reflect on what he's learned and to deepen his understanding. Part 2 represents a more mature phase of Zarathustra's philosophy, where he grapples with increasingly complex and challenging ideas. The Child with the Mirror. The opening chapter of Part 2 is brief but symbolically rich. Zarathustra encounters a child holding a mirror, and when he looks into it, he sees his own face distorted. It looks like a devil's face, mocking him. This unsettling vision disturbs Zarathustra deeply. The mirror shows him not how he sees himself, but how he might appear to others, or perhaps how he truly is beneath his self-conception. This chapter is about self-knowledge and self-deception. Zarathustra has been teaching others about transformation, about overcoming, about becoming the Overman. But the child's mirror forces him to confront the possibility that his own transformation is incomplete. that there's something demonic or distorted in his teaching, or that he himself has not yet achieved what he preaches. It's a moment of doubt, of questioning, of recognizing that the teacher himself is still in process, still struggling, still potentially deceived about his own nature and motives. The child with the mirror represents innocence confronting wisdom with uncomfortable truths. Children see through pretension. They reflect reality without the polite filters that adults use. And what the child's mirror shows Zarathustra is that he may not be the enlightened teacher he believes himself to be, or at least that his teaching may appear demonic, dangerous, destructive to those who view it from outside. This sets the tone for part 2. Zarathustra will continue teaching, but with a greater awareness of the difficulties, the dangers, the potential for his philosophy to be misunderstood or to go wrong. He's more cautious, more reflective, more aware of the complexity of what he's attempting upon the Blessed Isles. In this chapter, Zarathustra addresses the relationship between creativity and belief in God. He makes a startling claim: God is a conjecture. God is not a reality but a hypothesis, a projection, something humans have created in order to make sense of existence. And Zarathustra argues that belief in God actually inhibits human creativity and freedom. Why? Because if God is the ultimate creator, if God has already created everything and established all values and meanings, then what is left for humans to create? If we believe that the world is God's creation, that moral values come from divine command, that meaning is given by a transcendent source, then our role becomes merely receptive. We receive what God has given, we obey what God has commanded, we accept the meaning that God has established. There's no room for genuine human creativity, for us to be creators ourselves. But Zarathustra teaches that humans must become creators. The creative will is identical with freedom. To be free means to create your own values, your own meaning, your own purposes. And this is only possible if God doesn't exist, or more precisely, if we stop believing in God, stop looking to transcendent sources for meaning and value, and instead take on the terrible responsibility of creating these ourselves. This is one of the most profound implications of the death of God. It's not just that God is gone and we're left in a meaningless void. Rather, God's absence creates the possibility, indeed the necessity, for humans to become creators, to take on the role that was previously attributed to the divine. We must create values, create meanings, create purposes, and this is both terrifying and liberating. It's terrifying because it means there's no external validation, no guarantee that what we create is right or good or true, but it's liberating because it means we're genuinely free, genuinely able to determine our own nature and our own future. The Blessed Isles of the chapter title represent places of creative freedom, places where the creative will can flourish without being constrained by belief in God or adherence to traditional morality. These are symbolic spaces where new possibilities can be explored, where experimentation is possible, where the future can be invented rather than merely received. On the pitying. Now we come to one of Zarathustra's most controversial teachings, his critique of pity. Pity or compassion is widely regarded as one of the highest virtues, especially in Christianity. The ability to feel another's suffering, to be moved by their pain, to want to help them. This seems obviously good, obviously moral, but Zarathustra argues that pity is actually harmful, both to the person who feels it and to the person who receives it. Zarathustra says, "Verily I like them not, the merciful ones, whose bliss is in their pity. Too destitute are they of bashfulness." What does he mean by this? Those whose happiness comes from pitying others are lacking in a kind of shame or modesty. They're too comfortable with exposing others' weaknesses, too willing to place themselves in a position of superiority over the suffering person. When you pity someone, you're implicitly saying, "You are weak, you are suffering, you are less than whole, and I am here in my strength to help you." This creates a fundamentally unequal relationship, and the person being pitied feels this inequality. When someone shows you pity, when they make clear that they see you as suffering and weak, this wounds your pride, exposes your powerlessness, diminishes you. You may need the help, you may be grateful for it, but at the same time you resent the person who has placed you in this position of inferiority. The text describes this resentment eating away inside like a fungus. It's subtle, often unconscious, but it's corrosive to both parties. Zarathustra says, "If I must be pitiful, I dislike to be called so. And if I be so, it is preferably at a distance. If you're going to help someone, do it quietly. Do it from a distance. Don't make a show of your mercy and compassion. Don't force the suffering person to acknowledge their weakness and your strength. Don't turn your assistance into a performance of your own virtue." The people Zarathustra criticizes are those whose bliss is in their pity, those who actually enjoy feeling compassionate, who get satisfaction from being the helper, the savior, the one who has the power to alleviate suffering. There's another dimension to this critique. Zarathustra says, "For in seeing the sufferer suffering, thereof was I ashamed on account of his shame." When you witness someone's suffering, especially when that suffering involves degradation or humiliation, you're intruding on something private, something that the person would prefer you not see. It's like catching someone in an embarrassing moment. Your presence makes their situation worse, even if you mean well. And if you then rush to help them, you're forcing them to acknowledge that you've witnessed their weakness, their failure, their pain. So what should we do instead? Zarathustra offers an alternative. When we learn better to enjoy ourselves, then do we unlearn best to give pain unto others and to contrive pain. Instead of focusing on alleviating others' suffering, focus on increasing joy, both your own joy and others' joy. Learn to celebrate life, to create beauty, to generate positive experiences. Joy is generative and contagious. When you're genuinely joyful, when you're living well and fully, you naturally inspire others, naturally lift them up, without placing yourself in a position of superiority, without requiring them to acknowledge their weakness. This ties back to the concept of bestowing virtue from part 1. The person who has achieved genuine joy, genuine abundance, naturally gives from their overflow. They don't need to see others suffer in order to feel virtuous about helping them. They give because they have so much that giving is effortless, natural, joyful in itself. The critique of pity also connects to Nietzsche's broader philosophical concern with what he calls resentment. He believes that Christian morality, with its emphasis on pity and compassion for the weak, actually emerges from the resentment of the weak toward the strong. The weak cannot compete with the strong directly, cannot achieve power and excellence themselves, so instead they create a moral system that makes their weakness into a virtue and the strong strength into a vice. They call their weakness humility and meekness, and they call strength pride and arrogance. They make suffering into something noble, something that deserves compassion and assistance, thereby forcing the strong to serve them. From this perspective, pity is not simply a neutral emotion or a straightforward virtue. It's part of a complex moral system that inverts natural values, that makes weakness into strength and strength into weakness. And Zarathustra wants to overturn this inversion, to restore what he sees as natural, healthy values that celebrate strength, excellence, joy, and creative power, rather than weakness, suffering, and need. This is difficult teaching. We're so accustomed to thinking of compassion as unambiguously good that Zarathustra's critique feels shocking, perhaps even cruel. But Nietzsche is asking us to think more deeply about the psychology of helping relationships, about the subtle power dynamics involved in pity, and about whether there might be better ways to relate to others' suffering, ways that don't diminish either party, ways that focus on creating joy rather than merely alleviating pain. On priests. When a group of priests passes by, Zarathustra uses the opportunity to teach his disciples about the complicated nature of the priestly type. And his teaching is surprisingly nuanced. He doesn't simply dismiss priests as frauds or villains. Instead, he acknowledges that priests often have noble intentions, that they're self-sacrificing, that they seek something higher than themselves. In these respects, Zarathustra says, priests are actually like him. They too want to serve something greater. They too are willing to sacrifice for their ideals. They too point toward transcendence. But there's a crucial difference. Priests teach people to look away from this earth, to devalue this life in favor of an imagined afterlife. They encourage people to see their earthly existence as temporary, fallen, corrupted, something to be endured rather than celebrated. And they frame their own suffering and self-sacrifice in terms of sin, guilt, and the need for redemption. This is where the priestly type goes wrong. Their noble impulse towards something higher gets channeled into otherworldly thinking, into body hatred, into the devaluation of life. Their self-sacrifice becomes not a joyful giving from abundance, but a resentful denial of their own vitality. They make suffering into a virtue. They make guilt into a tool of control, and they make human beings feel small, sinful, and dependent on divine grace. Zarathustra sees the tragedy here. The priestly instinct, the desire to serve something higher, to sacrifice for a great cause, to point beyond mere animal existence, is not itself bad. In fact, it's necessary for human greatness, but Christianity has perverted this instinct, has channeled it in destructive directions, has turned it against life itself. And priests are both victims and perpetrators of this perversion. They're victims because their own noble impulses have been corrupted by the religious framework they inhabit. They're perpetrators because they spread this life-denying ideology to others, making whole populations sick with guilt and otherworldly longing. On the virtuous. In the chapter On the Virtuous, Zarathustra continues his critique of conventional morality by examining those who pride themselves on being virtuous according to traditional standards. These are the people who follow the rules, who do their duty, who live according to accepted moral codes. And on the surface, this seems admirable. But Zarathustra sees a problem. Their virtue is not genuine, not life-affirming, not truly their own. The virtuous people Zarathustra criticizes are those who seek rewards for their virtue. They want to be praised, they want to feel superior, they want recognition for their goodness. Their virtue is transactional. They're good because they expect something in return, whether that's social approval, heavenly reward, or simply the satisfying feeling of being morally superior to others. This is what Nietzsche would call herd morality, morality that comes from conformity to group standards rather than from individual creative will. Zarathustra asks these virtuous people what they truly want, and their answer reveals the poverty of their virtue. They want happiness, they want comfort, they want security. Their morality is essentially conservative. It's about maintaining what they have, avoiding risk, ensuring predictability. There's no creative impulse, no striving for greatness, no will to overcome themselves and become something more. They've achieved a certain level of moral respectability, and now they want to rest there, to be secure in their goodness. But remember what Zarathustra said in part 1 about the 3 metamorphoses. The camel stage involves bearing burdens, following rules, accepting duties. These virtuous people are camels who have never transformed into lions. They've never rebelled against external authority, never questioned the values they were taught, never cleared space for their own creative will, and therefore they can never become children, can never achieve that innocent creativity that generates genuinely new values. Their virtue is a weight they carry, not a gift they bestow. It's duty rather than joy, obligation rather than overflow. And Zarathustra finds this sad, limiting, ultimately life-denying. True virtue, as he taught in On the Bestowing Virtue, emerges from abundance and gives freely. It doesn't calculate rewards or seek recognition. It simply pours forth because it cannot help but do so. On the rabble. The chapter On the Rabble is one of Zarathustra's harshest moments. He's experiencing nausea, disgust at the masses of humanity, at what he calls the rabble. And we need to understand what Nietzsche means by this term, because it's easily misunderstood as simple snobbery or elitism. Zarathustra says, "Life is a well of delight, but where the rabble also drink, there all fountains are poisoned." The rabble aren't simply poor people or working-class people or uneducated people. Rather, the rabble are those who contaminate everything they touch, who drag everything down to their own level, who cannot appreciate or create anything of value. They represent the leveling tendency, the pull toward mediocrity, the force that makes everything common and vulgar. Think about what happens when something beautiful, something excellent, something rare enters the public sphere. It gets simplified, commercialized, reduced to its most accessible form. Nuance disappears. Complexity gets flattened. What was once special becomes mundane. This is what Zarathustra means when he says the rabble poison the fountains. They don't necessarily intend to destroy beauty or excellence, they simply can't help it. Their touch contaminates because they lack the refinement, the taste, the discipline, the education to appreciate or preserve what's valuable. Zarathustra experiences physical nausea when confronted with the rabble. This is not a mere figure of speech. He's genuinely sickened by their presence, by their values, by their way of being in the world. And he wonders, is this disgust necessary? Is the rabble perhaps necessary for life itself? Perhaps the existence of the rabble, of the masses who remain mediocre, is what makes greatness possible by contrast. Perhaps you need the low to appreciate the high, need the common to make the rare valuable. But even if this is true, it doesn't make the experience any easier. Zarathustra finds he must rise above the rabble, must physically and spiritually distance himself from them in order to find purity, peace, and valuable friendship. Only by withdrawing from the masses can he maintain his own standards, his own values, his own commitment to excellence. This is why he keeps returning to his mountain. He needs that separation, that elevation, that distance from the leveling influence of the crowd. On the tarantulas. The chapter on the tarantulas is one of the most politically charged in the entire book. The tarantulas are preachers of equality, those who claim that all people are equal and that justice means making everyone the same. And Zarathustra sees this egalitarian ideology as poisonous, as driven by revenge and resentment rather than genuine concern for justice. He tells a parable. The tarantulas are spiders whose bite injects venom, and that venom is the doctrine of equality. They preach that everyone should be made equal, that differences in power, ability, and achievement are unjust and must be eliminated. They speak in the language of justice and fairness, but Zarathustra sees through this. He says, "Vengeance will we use, and insult against all who are not like us. Thus do the tarantula hearts pledge themselves. Their justice is merely disguised revenge against those who are superior to them." Think about the psychology here. If you're weak, if you lack power and excellence, if you cannot compete successfully with those who are stronger and more capable than you, what can you do? One option is to work harder, to develop yourself, to strive for improvement. But another option is to change the rules of the game entirely. You can declare that all differences in achievement are unjust, that equality is the highest value, that those who have more must be brought down to your level in the name of fairness. The tarantulas, Zarathustra says, equate virtue with the will to equality. They make equality itself into the supreme moral principle. But this is a fundamental error because life itself is characterized by inequality, by difference, by hierarchy. Some organisms are stronger, some are weaker, some are more complex, some are simpler. Some are more adapted to their environment, some are less so. And among humans there are genuine differences in ability, in character, in achievement. To deny these differences, to try to eliminate them, is to deny life itself. Zarathustra warns his followers not to confuse him with the tarantulas. Some people who claim to follow his teaching might actually be tarantulas in disguise, people who want to tear down the powerful and excellent out of resentment. But Zarathustra's teaching is not about revenge or leveling. He's not trying to bring everyone down to the same level. Rather, he's trying to show how humanity can rise, how we can overcome ourselves and become something greater. To him, justice does not mean equality. Justice means recognizing and honoring genuine differences in value and ability. It means acknowledging that people are not all the same, that some have achieved more than others, that some embody higher values than others. And if there were true equality, if everyone were already the same, then how could anyone overcome themselves? How could humanity strive toward the Übermensch? The very project of self-overcoming presupposes inequality. It presupposes that we're currently at a lower level and can rise to a higher one. The tarantulas protest against all power, against all excellence, against all superiority. They want to drag everything down to their level. But Zarathustra says this protest is really a tyrannical appetite, a repressed envy. The tarantulas are actually power-hungry themselves. They want power over those who are currently superior to them. Their egalitarian ideology is just a tool for achieving that power. Once they succeed in bringing down the excellent, they will establish their own tyranny, their own form of domination. This critique has uncomfortable, contemporary relevance. We live in an age obsessed with equality, with eliminating all forms of hierarchy and difference, and much of this concern is genuinely motivated by a desire for justice, by a recognition that many historical hierarchies were based on arbitrary factors like race, gender, or birth, rather than genuine merit. But Nietzsche asks us to be suspicious of egalitarian rhetoric, to examine the motivations behind it, to consider whether the will to equality might sometimes be driven by resentment and revenge rather than justice. On the Famous Wise Men. On the Famous Wise Men, Zarathustra addresses those philosophers and intellectuals who have achieved public recognition and acclaim. These are the thinkers whose work is celebrated, whose books are widely read, whose opinions are sought and valued by the public. And Zarathustra's judgment is harsh. These famous wise ones have compromised truth in order to please the people. He says, "The people have ye served, and the people's superstition, not the truth. All ye famous wise ones, and just on that account did they pay you reverence." The famous philosophers became famous precisely because they told people what they wanted to hear, because they justified popular prejudices and conventional beliefs, because they made people comfortable rather than challenging them. Think about what this means. Genuine philosophy, the genuine pursuit of truth, is often uncomfortable, disturbing, challenging. It questions assumptions, it overturns conventional wisdom, it forces people to confront difficult realities. But this kind of philosophy doesn't make you famous. It makes you unpopular, controversial, even dangerous. The masses don't want to be challenged or disturbed. They want their existing beliefs confirmed, their prejudices rationalized, their comfort maintained. So philosophers who want fame and public approval learn to serve the people rather than truth. They learn to dress up popular opinions in philosophical language, to provide sophisticated justifications for conventional morality, to make the crowd feel wise and enlightened without actually challenging anything important. The relationship is mutually beneficial. The philosopher gets fame and recognition, and the people get intellectual validation for their existing beliefs. But truth is sacrificed in the process. Zarathustra contrasts these famous wise ones with what he calls the conscientious ones, the true free spirits who pursue truth regardless of popularity or reward. These genuine philosophers receive no fame, no public acclaim, no comfortable positions. Instead, they face suffering, sacrifice, isolation. They dwell in the wilderness, not in the cities where the well-foddered famous wise ones live. But through this suffering and isolation, their spirits are strengthened, their understanding deepens, and they achieve genuine insight rather than merely clever rationalization of popular belief. This is a personal theme for Nietzsche. He himself never achieved the kind of fame and recognition during his lifetime that many of his contemporaries enjoyed. He was often isolated, often misunderstood, often dismissed or ignored by the academic establishment. But he believed he was pursuing genuine truth rather than merely pleasing the public, and he saw his lack of fame as evidence of his integrity rather than his failure. On self-overcoming. The chapter on self-overcoming introduces one of Nietzsche's most important philosophical concepts, the will to power. This is not a simple concept, and it's often misunderstood, so we need to examine it carefully. Zarathustra begins with an observation. Everything that lives obeys. Even the seemingly most powerful beings obey something, and if you cannot obey yourself, someone else will command you. This sets up the fundamental dynamic. There's either self-command or external command. Either you obey your own will or you obey someone else's. But commanding yourself is more difficult and dangerous than obeying others. Why? Because when you obey others, you can blame them if things go wrong. You can say you were just following orders, just doing what was expected. But when you command yourself, you bear full responsibility for your choices and their consequences. There's no one else to blame, no external authority to hide behind. Yet, despite the difficulty and danger, we are all driven to self-command by what Nietzsche calls the will to power. This is the fundamental drive of all living things. It's not primarily a desire to dominate others, though that can be one expression of it. Rather, it's the drive to increase one's power, to expand one's capabilities, to overcome obstacles, to grow and develop. The will to power expresses itself at all levels of existence. Even those who are commanded, even those who obey others, are exercising their will to power. They obey so that they may gain enough power to command those who are weaker than themselves. Everyone is engaged in this fundamental struggle for power, this perpetual effort to increase their strength and capability. And here's the crucial insight. Because power can only be gained through discipline and self-mastery, because you must first learn to command yourself before you can effectively command others, life is fundamentally characterized by self-overcoming. Life always seeks to overcome itself, to transcend its current limitations, to become something more than it currently is. This is why nothing is permanent or absolute, not truth, not morality, not even God. Everything is in flux, everything is constantly transforming, because the will to power drives continuous self-overcoming. This has profound implications. It means that human nature is not fixed, that we're not stuck being what we currently are. We have the capacity to overcome ourselves, to transform ourselves, to become something different and potentially greater. But it also means that this process never ends. There's no final state of perfection, no ultimate goal where we can rest. The will to power keeps pushing, keeps demanding more, keeps driving us to surpass ourselves again and again. Part 2. The Sublime Ones, Land of Culture, Immaculate Perception, and Scholars. On the Sublime Ones. On the Sublime Ones, Zarathustra addresses a particular type of person who has achieved a degree of greatness but remains fundamentally flawed. These are heroic types, people of exceptional strength and accomplishment, who nevertheless lack something essential. They lack lightness, joy, laughter. They are sublime in their seriousness, in their dedication, in their achievements, but they remain heavy, grim, unable to dance. The sublime ones that Zarathustra describes have overcome tremendous obstacles. They've conquered their impulses, disciplined themselves rigorously, achieved mastery in their domains. In this sense, they represent a genuine form of greatness. They're not mediocre, not part of the rabble, not last men content with comfort. They've accomplished something real, but their method of self-overcoming has left them scarred, rigid, unable to enjoy what they've achieved. Think of someone who has spent their entire life in stern self-discipline, who has denied themselves pleasure and ease in pursuit of some great goal. Perhaps they've achieved that goal. Perhaps they've become powerful, accomplished, respected. But they've lost the ability to be light, to laugh, to play. Their faces are stern masks. Their bodies are tense, their movements controlled and measured. They've become heroic, but they've lost something essentially human, or perhaps something essentially superhuman, because what Zarathustra values most is the ability to dance, to laugh, to be light even while being profound. Zarathustra says that these sublime ones still have too much tension in their souls. They're always straining, always effortful, always serious, and this reveals that they haven't fully overcome themselves. They've achieved control through force, through harsh discipline, but they haven't achieved the kind of integrated wholeness that allows for genuine freedom and lightness. They're still at war with themselves, still bearing the scars of that internal battle. What would it mean to overcome oneself completely? It would mean achieving such perfect integration, such complete mastery that effort disappears. The accomplished musician doesn't strain to play. The music flows effortlessly from years of practice that have become second nature. The master athlete moves with grace, not tension, and the truly sublime human being, the one who has genuinely overcome themselves, would move through life with the same kind of effortless mastery, the same lightness, the same capacity for joy. Zarathustra wants these sublime ones to become more beautiful. He wants them to learn to laugh at themselves, to dance, to be light even in their greatness. Only then will they truly embody the spirit of the child from the 3 Metamorphoses, that innocent creativity, that joyful affirmation, that playful engagement with existence. Without this lightness, even their greatness remains incomplete, remains too heavy, remains somehow life-denying, rather than fully life-affirming. On the land of culture. On the Land of Culture presents Zarathustra's critique of his contemporary society, what he calls the land of culture or the land of education. Zarathustra tells a strange story. He flew too far into the future and was horrified by what he saw there. Only time stretching on endlessly, emptiness, meaninglessness. So he hurried back to the present, to the land of culture where his contemporaries live. But when he arrives back in the present, he finds something equally disturbing. The people of the land of culture appear to him as painted with 50 blotches, surrounded by mirrors in which they admire themselves. What does this mean? These people are not authentic. They're covered with layers of paint, with borrowed ideas, with cultural affectations that they've adopted from various sources without genuine integration or understanding. Think about someone who has had what we call a good education. They've read widely, they know about art and philosophy and history. They can reference classical texts and discuss abstract ideas. But all of this knowledge remains superficial, remains merely decorative. They've painted themselves with cultural sophistication, but underneath there's no substance, no authentic self, no genuine creativity or understanding. They're like actors playing roles, like people wearing costumes, constantly checking mirrors to see how they appear to others. The land of culture is a place where everything is derivative, where nothing is original or authentic. The signs and symbols that should carry meaning have been painted over so many times that they've become unintelligible. You can't read what's actually there because it's been covered with layers of new paint, new interpretations, new fashionable ideas. The culture has become so self-referential, so caught up in its own reflections, that it has lost contact with genuine experience and genuine creativity. Zarathustra feels homeless in this land of culture. He doesn't belong here among these painted people admiring themselves in mirrors. He finds them ridiculous, and he has to laugh at them, though it's not a joyful laugh, but a bitter one. Neither the empty future nor the superficial present offers him a home. So where does he belong? He says he belongs to his children's land, to the undiscovered future where his spiritual descendants might one day create something genuinely new. This is a profound form of alienation. Zarathustra is separated not just from the masses, not just from the rabble, but even from the cultivated, educated, sophisticated people of his time. They're perhaps worse than the rabble in some ways, because their sophistication is a kind of lie, a pretense that conceals the absence of genuine substance. At least the rabble doesn't pretend to be what it's not, but the people of the land of culture live entirely in pretense, in borrowed identities, in reflected images. On Immaculate Perception. On Immaculate Perception, Zarathustra takes aim at a particular form of intellectual error that he sees in scholars, scientists, and philosophers of his time. These are people who claim to seek pure knowledge, who insist that they merely want to perceive reality objectively without imposing their own will or desires upon it. They present themselves as neutral observers, as mirrors that simply reflect what's there without distorting it. And Zarathustra says this is fundamentally dishonest. There's no such thing as immaculate perception, no such thing as pure objectivity. These scholars claim to want knowledge without desire, perception without will. But this is a lie they tell themselves. They do desire, they do will, but they've repressed this aspect of themselves and called that repression objectivity. He uses a powerful metaphor. These people want to be like the moon, which merely reflects the sun's light without generating any light of its own. They want to be passive, receptive, reflecting rather than radiating. But Zarathustra says this is a form of impotence, a failure of creativity. The moon cannot create, cannot generate, cannot produce anything new. It can only reflect what already exists. And the scholars who seek immaculate perception are similarly sterile. They observe, they analyze, they categorize, but they never create anything genuinely new. Why do they adopt this stance of pure objectivity? Zarathustra suggests it's because they feel guilty about their desires, guilty about imposing themselves on the world. They want to look at reality without touching it, want to know without changing, want to perceive without creating. This sounds noble, but it's actually a form of cowardice, a refusal to engage fully with life. It's another version of the body hatred and life denial that Zarathustra has criticized throughout the book. Real knowledge, genuine understanding, cannot be separated from desire and will. When you truly know something, when you genuinely understand it, you're not just passively receiving information, you're actively engaging, actively interpreting, actively creating meaning. Knowledge is like the sun's light, Zarathustra says. It's not separate from what it illuminates, but rather the medium through which things become visible and comprehensible. Moreover, beauty, which these scholars claim to appreciate from their detached objective distance, requires love and willing. You cannot truly perceive beauty while remaining cold and distant. Beauty reveals itself only to those who are willing to love, willing to desire, willing to engage creatively with what they perceive. The scholars who maintain their immaculate perception are actually incapable of experiencing genuine beauty, because they've cut themselves off from the very capacities that make such experience possible. Zarathustra admits that he himself was once led astray by this ideal of pure knowledge. He thought that objectivity was possible, that he could perceive truth without his own will and desire interfering. But he came to understand that this was an illusion. All knowledge involves perspective, involves interpretation, involves the active participation of the knower. And rather than seeing this as a limitation or a corruption of knowledge, Zarathustra came to see it as the very nature of knowledge itself. We don't need immaculate perception. We need engaged, creative, life-affirming perception that acknowledges its own active role in creating meaning. On scholars. The chapter on scholars continues Zarathustra's critique of academic and intellectual culture, but with a different focus. Here he's not primarily concerned with their false claim to objectivity, but rather with how scholarly life shapes character and limits human possibility. Zarathustra presents himself in contrast to the scholars. He says that he once engaged in scholarly work. He sat where scholars sit. He produced the kind of knowledge they produce. But he left that life behind. Why? Because scholarly existence is fundamentally incompatible with the kind of self-overcoming and creative transformation that Zarathustra values. The scholar's life is characterized by certain qualities that Zarathustra finds limiting. Scholars are driven by what he calls a thirst for knowledge, but this thirst is often petty, focused on small questions, minor disputes, accumulation of facts without larger purpose. They work diligently in their narrow specializations, mastering small domains of knowledge, but they lack the broader vision, the grand aspiration, the creative power to imagine something genuinely new. Moreover, scholars are constrained by their need for approval from other scholars, by the demands of institutional life, by the conventions of their disciplines. They cannot freely pursue truth wherever it leads because they must publish in acceptable journals, must gain the approval of their peers, must advance through institutional hierarchies. This creates a subtle but powerful form of conformity. Scholars learn what questions are acceptable to ask, what methods are legitimate to use, what conclusions are safe to reach. Anything too radical, too challenging, too genuinely original risks their careers. Zarathustra notes that scholars have been subjugated by the ideals of modern democracy. What does this mean? The scholarly ideal emphasizes equality. All scholars are peers. All opinions deserve consideration. Consensus and committee decisions replace individual genius and vision. Excellence and greatness become suspect. The scholar who claims to have discovered something genuinely revolutionary, who asserts their own vision against the consensus, who breaks dramatically with tradition. Such a person is viewed with suspicion, is accused of arrogance or hubris. The democratic leveling that affects broader culture also affects scholarly life, preventing the emergence of truly exceptional individuals. Furthermore, scholars are not permitted to want the Overman as Zarathustra does. Why not? Because the Overman represents a radical break with all existing values, a transformation so complete that it would overturn everything that scholars have carefully built up. Scholarly work is cumulative, conservative in the literal sense. It conserves and builds upon what previous scholars have established. But Zarathustra's philosophy demands something different. Not conservation and accumulation, but transformation and overcoming. These are fundamentally incompatible approaches. Yet, Zarathustra doesn't simply dismiss all scholars. He acknowledges that scholarly work has its place, that the accumulation and preservation of knowledge serves certain important functions, but he's clear that scholarly life is not for him, and that those who are called to genuine philosophy, to creative transformation, to the pursuit of the Overman, must free themselves from the constraints of scholarly existence. They must be willing to work alone, to risk error, to pursue truth without the safety net of institutional approval and peer validation. This creates a fundamental tension in Nietzsche's own life and work. He was trained as a classical scholar, held an academic position for a time, but ultimately found scholarly life incompatible with his philosophical vision. He left academia and worked in isolation, producing works that were largely ignored or misunderstood during his lifetime. The chapter on scholars can be read as Nietzsche's own justification for this choice, his own explanation of why genuine philosophy requires breaking free from scholarly constraints. Part 2. Conclusion, Poets, Great Events, Redemption, The Stillest Hour and Beginning. Part 3. On the Poets. Zarathustra now turns his critical eye to poets, and his critique is particularly biting because, in a sense, Nietzsche himself is writing a kind of philosophical poetry in this very book. The chapter involves a conversation between Zarathustra and one of his disciples about the nature and value of poetry and poets. Zarathustra says he has grown tired of poets. Why? Because they all muddy their waters to make them appear deep. This is a devastating image. Poets intentionally obscure their meaning, create ambiguity, add complexity, not because their thoughts are genuinely profound, but because they want to appear profound. They stir up the mud at the bottom of shallow waters to create the illusion of depth. They use elaborate language, dense metaphors, cryptic symbolism, not to express genuinely complex ideas that require such treatment, but to disguise the simplicity or even emptiness of what they're actually saying. Moreover, poets are too concerned with their audience. They crave spectators, they perform, they want applause and recognition. They're not genuinely seeking truth or creating from authentic inner necessity. Instead, they're calculating effects, trying to impress, working for reaction and response. This makes their art fundamentally dishonest. It's directed outward toward pleasing or shocking an audience, rather than emerging from genuine inner experience and necessity. But then Zarathustra's disciple asks an uncomfortable question. But you yourself, Zarathustra, are you not also a poet? This puts Zarathustra in a difficult position. He cannot simply dismiss all poetry without acknowledging that he himself uses poetic language, tells parables, speaks in metaphors and symbols. So how can he critique poets while being one himself? Zarathustra's response reveals an important distinction. He admits that poets lie too much, that he himself has lied too much in his poetic mode, but he's learning, he's developing, he's moving beyond mere poetry towards something more direct and truthful. The implication is that poetry is perhaps a necessary stage, a way of approaching difficult truths indirectly when they cannot yet be stated directly. But it's ultimately a limitation to be overcome, not an endpoint to be celebrated. This self-critical moment is significant. Zarathustra is not claiming to have transcended all the errors he criticizes in others. He acknowledges his own complicity, his own past mistakes, his own ongoing struggle. And this makes his teaching more credible, more honest. He's not speaking from some achieved position of perfection, but from the midst of ongoing transformation, on great events. In On Great Events, Zarathustra tells a parable about visiting an island with a fire-spitting mountain, a volcano, and encountering a creature called the fire dog, which represents the destructive forces of revolution, upheaval, and historical cataclysm. This chapter explores the relationship between noise and significance, between dramatic events and genuine transformation. The fire dog speaks with tremendous noise, spouting revolutionary rhetoric about overthrowing the old order and bringing forth something new. It represents the kind of violent historical upheaval that seems world-changing, that generates enormous attention and excitement, that appears to be of supreme importance. Think of revolutions, wars, the rise and fall of empires. These are what most people consider great events, the turning points of history. But Zarathustra disagrees. He tells the fire dog, "The greatest events are not our noisiest but our stillest hours. The truly transformative moments in history are not the loud, dramatic, violent upheavals that everyone notices. Rather, they're the quiet moments when someone has a genuinely new thought, when a new value is created, when someone's understanding shifts in a fundamental way." He says, "Not around the inventors of new noise, but around the inventors of new values doth the world revolve." This is a profound insight about the nature of historical change. The events that make the most noise, that generate the most immediate attention, battles, revolutions, political crises, are often less significant in the long run than the quiet work of thinkers, artists, and creators who are inventing new ways of understanding and valuing existence. The invention of Christianity, for example, began not with armies or political power, but with the teaching of an obscure preacher to a small group of followers. The scientific revolution began not with dramatic public events, but with the quiet work of individuals thinking new thoughts in their studies. Moreover, Zarathustra suggests that the loudest events are often merely surface phenomena, expressions of deeper currents rather than genuine causes. The fire dog makes a lot of noise, but it's not creating anything genuinely new. It's just expressing rage and resentment, just destroying what exists without having the capacity to build something better in its place. Genuine creation, genuine transformation, happens more quietly, more subtly, more slowly. This teaching has implications for how we should direct our own energies. If we want to change the world, we shouldn't necessarily seek the dramatic gesture, the revolutionary action, the public spectacle. Instead, we should focus on the harder, quieter work of genuine creation, developing new ideas, creating new values, achieving personal transformation that might eventually influence others. The stillest hours, not the noisiest events, are where real change happens. On redemption. On redemption is one of the most philosophically important chapters in the entire book, because here Zarathustra begins to address the problem of time, past, and the will's relationship to what has already happened. The chapter begins with Zarathustra encountering a group of crippled and deformed people who ask him to heal them, to make them whole. But Zarathustra refuses. He says, "When one takes away the hump from the hunchback, one takes away his spirit." What does this strange statement mean? Zarathustra is saying that our limitations, our deformities, even our sufferings are part of what makes us who we are. To simply remove them would not make us whole. It would destroy the very person we've become through living with those limitations. The hunchback has developed in response to his hump, has built his entire way of being around that physical reality. To remove it would leave him without his organizing principle, without the spirit that makes him specifically who he is. This is connected to a deeper problem about redemption, about the desire to undo the past. Traditional Christianity offers redemption from sin, redemption from the fallen state of humanity, redemption from all that has gone wrong in history. But this redemption is always projected into the future, into an afterlife, into a coming kingdom of God, into some future state where all wrongs will be righted and all suffering will be compensated. But Zarathustra sees a fundamental problem with the will's relationship to the past. The will can command the future, can create, can change what doesn't yet exist. But the will cannot change what has already happened. The past is fixed, unchangeable, beyond the reach of even the strongest will. And this creates what Zarathustra calls the will's ill will against time and its "it was." The will resents time because time makes things permanent, makes the past unchangeable, sets limits on what can be willed. This resentment against time, this frustration with the unchangeability of the past, is the source of the spirit of revenge. We feel rage at what has happened, rage at what we cannot change, rage at time itself for making the past permanent. And this rage poisons everything. It makes us unable to affirm life as it actually is, unable to accept existence with all its accidents and sufferings and irreversible events. We want the past to be different. We want to undo what has been done, and our inability to do so fills us with resentment. So what would redemption mean from Zarathustra's perspective? It would mean overcoming this resentment against time, this rage at the unchangeability of the past. It would mean learning to will backwards as well as forwards, to somehow affirm the past as necessary, to say yes, even to what has happened and cannot be changed. But how is this possible? Zarathustra doesn't fully answer this question yet. He's circling around an idea that will become central in Part 3, the idea of eternal recurrence. But here in On Redemption, he's identifying the problem that eternal recurrence will attempt to solve. The stillest hour. Part 2 concludes with The Stillest Hour, a deeply personal and painful chapter where Zarathustra describes a mystical experience that forces him to leave his disciples once again and return to solitude. He tells them that his stillest hour, his awesome mistress, has spoken to him, has commanded him, and he must obey. What is this stillest hour? It's a kind of inner voice, a deeper wisdom within Zarathustra himself that sees more clearly than his conscious will. It speaks without voice, it commands without words, and what it says terrifies him. The stillest hour tells him, "You know, Zarathustra, but you do not speak." In other words, Zarathustra has understood something, has grasped some terrible truth, but he's holding back, refusing to teach it openly. When Zarathustra protests that he has been teaching, that he has been sharing his wisdom with his disciples, the stillest hour responds that he has not been teaching what is most important, what is most difficult, what is most necessary. He knows something more, something deeper, something that he himself fears to speak. And until he finds the courage to speak this knowledge, he is not truly fulfilling his mission. The stillest hour also tells Zarathustra that he is not yet humble enough. This is a striking claim because humility is usually associated with traditional morality, with Christian virtues that Zarathustra has been criticizing throughout the book. But here the stillest hour demands a different kind of humility. Not the humility of self-abasement, but the humility of accepting your destiny, of being willing to be broken by your task, of recognizing that what you must teach is greater and more terrible than you yourself are comfortable with. Zarathustra weeps as he tells his disciples this. He doesn't want to leave them. His love for them, for humanity, for the people he's been teaching, this love is holding him back from becoming what he must become, from teaching what he must teach. The stillest hour tells him he must grow harder, must overcome his pity and his love, must be willing to command rather than merely to teach and suggest. And so in the middle of the night, Zarathustra leaves once again. He returns to solitude, to deeper contemplation, to preparation for the final and most difficult teaching. Part 2 ends with this departure, with Zarathustra facing his last lonesomeness, ready to descend into the darkest depths before he can ascend to his highest teaching. Part 3, The Wanderer. Part 3 opens with Zarathustra climbing a mountain, describing it as his longest wandering. He says, "Before my highest mountain do I stand, and before my longest wandering, therefore must I first go deeper down than I ever ascended." This sets the tone for Part 3, which will be darker, more intense, more psychologically demanding than what has come before. Zarathustra is about to confront his most difficult teaching, his most challenging insight, and he knows that before he can teach it to others, he must first fully experience it himself, must descend into the depths of what this knowledge means. The image is of a mountain climber who must first descend into a deep valley before being able to climb the highest peak. Or perhaps it's the image of a diver who must go down into dark waters before surfacing with treasure. Part 3. The Vision and the Riddle. Eternal Recurrence. On the Vision and the Riddle. The On the Vision and the Riddle is one of the most crucial chapters in the entire book, because here Zarathustra begins to reveal his most abysmal thought, the idea of eternal recurrence. This is the teaching that his stillest hour commanded him to speak, the knowledge that terrifies him, the insight that will either destroy or transform anyone who truly grasps it. Zarathustra tells his companions that he will speak to them of his encounter with the most solitary man. He describes climbing a mountain path in grim twilight, resisting something that sits on him like a burden, the spirit of gravity, which he describes as half dwarf, half mole. This dwarf represents heaviness, seriousness, the weight of traditional thinking that drags us down and prevents us from climbing higher. The dwarf mocks Zarathustra, telling him he cannot go higher. that stones will roll back down on him, that he's foolish to attempt this ascent. But Zarathustra summons his courage and confronts the dwarf. He says, "Either you or I must die." He will not allow this spirit of gravity to continue weighing him down, preventing his ascent. And then Zarathustra presents the dwarf with a riddle, pointing to a gateway that stands before them. This gateway is marked with a single word, moment. From this gateway, two paths extend in opposite directions. One path stretches backward into the past. It runs for an eternity, and everything that has ever happened has already run along this path. The other path stretches forward into the future, another eternity, and everything that will happen must run along this path. These two paths contradict each other, oppose each other face to face, yet they meet at this single gateway called moment. Zarathustra asked the dwarf, "Must not whatever can run have already run this lane? Must not whatever can happen have already happened, have already been done, have already passed? If the path behind us extends for an eternity, if infinite time has already elapsed, then everything that can possibly happen must have already happened at some point in that infinite past. There's nothing new under the sun, so to speak. Everything has already occurred during the infinite time that preceded this moment. But here's where it gets strange." Zarathustra continues, "And if everything has already existed, what do you think, dwarf, of this moment? Must not this gateway too have already existed? The moment itself, this very now in which we stand, must also have already occurred in that infinite past. But if this moment has already occurred before, then everything that follows from it, including the entire future, must also have already occurred. And if the future has already occurred, then it must occur again when time cycles back around." The dwarf jumps down and says, "All truth is crooked. Time itself is a circle." The dwarf thinks he's solved the riddle easily. Time is circular. Everything repeats. There's nothing mysterious here. But Zarathustra is angry at this simplistic answer. The dwarf has not grasped the full horror and depth of what Zarathustra is suggesting. He's treated it as an intellectual puzzle to be quickly solved, rather than an existential challenge that transforms everything. What Zarathustra is beginning to articulate is the doctrine of eternal recurrence or eternal return. The idea is this: if time is infinite, and if the amount of matter and energy in the universe is finite, then every possible configuration of matter must eventually occur, and must occur not just once but infinitely many times. This moment, this exact configuration of reality, has occurred before and will occur again, not just once, but infinitely many times throughout infinite time. Think about what this means for your life. Everything you've ever done, every thought you've ever had, every experience you've undergone, all of it has happened before in exactly the same way, and all of it will happen again in exactly the same way, infinitely many times. You will live your exact same life, with all its joys and sufferings, its triumphs and failures, its meanings and meaninglessness, over and over and over again, eternally. This is the thought that Zarathustra calls abysmal, the thought that his stillest hour commanded him to speak, the thought that he can barely endure himself. And we begin to understand why. If you believed in eternal recurrence, how would it change how you live? If every moment of your life is destined to repeat infinitely, if every choice you make will be made again and again forever, how does this affect the value and meaning of those choices? But before Zarathustra can fully develop this teaching, the vision changes. Suddenly he finds himself in a different scene, a desolate place among wild cliffs, where he encounters a young shepherd who is choking. A heavy black snake has crawled into the shepherd's mouth and bitten down in his throat, lodging itself there. The shepherd is suffocating, dying, and Zarathustra tries desperately to pull the snake out, but cannot. Then something extraordinary happens. Zarathustra cries out to the shepherd, "Bite, bite its head off, bite." The shepherd in his extremity follows this command. He bites down on the snake's head, severs it, spits it out, and immediately he is transformed. He leaps up, no longer a shepherd but something more, and he laughs. He laughs as no human being has ever laughed before. It's a terrible, sublime, transformative laughter. The laughter of someone who has overcome something deadly, who has bitten through to liberation. Who is this shepherd? And what does the snake represent? The shepherd symbolizes humanity. or perhaps the higher type of human being that Zarathustra is trying to create. The snake represents the doctrine of eternal recurrence itself, or perhaps the suffocating weight of existence, or perhaps the old values that are choking humanity to death. The snake has to be confronted, has to be bitten through, has to be consumed and rejected. One interpretation is that the shepherd represents someone who has heard the doctrine of eternal recurrence and is choking on it, suffocating under its terrible weight. The thought that everything repeats eternally, that nothing can be escaped or overcome, that we're trapped in an infinite cycle. This thought is the snake. It's suffocating, deadly, unbearable. You can't simply pull it out, can't simply forget it or ignore it once you've heard it. The only way through is to bite down on it, to face it fully, to consume and overcome it. And when you do, when you truly confront eternal recurrence and affirm it, when you bite through the horror and say yes to the eternal repetition of all things, then you are transformed. You become the laughing one, the one who has overcome, the one who can affirm existence so completely that you would will its eternal return. This is the ultimate test of life affirmation. Can you say yes to your life as it is, in all its details, knowing that it will repeat exactly as it is, eternally? Can you not just accept this, but will it, desire it, affirm it joyfully? The chapter ends with Zarathustra asking, "Who is the shepherd into whose throat the snake thus crawled? Who is the man into whose throat all that is heaviest and blackest will thus crawl?" This is the riddle he leaves with his listeners. The vision of the shepherd and the snake is connected to the teaching about the gateway and eternal recurrence, but the connection is not explained. It's left as a puzzle for those who have the capacity to solve it. On involuntary bliss, after presenting this terrifying vision and teaching, Zarathustra is overwhelmed with emotion. The chapter on involuntary bliss describes his state as he continues his journey. He carries enigmas and bitterness in his heart as he sails over the sea. The teaching about eternal recurrence has cost him something. He's revealed his most abysmal thought and it has shaken him to his core. But then, after 4 days of journey from the Blessed Isles where his friends live, something shifts. He overcomes his pain, he accepts his fate triumphantly with firm foot, and he begins to speak to his exulting conscience, begins to understand what he must do. Zarathustra realizes that he is like a lighthouse that must stand firm by the sea, gnarled and crooked and with flexible hardness, a living lighthouse of unconquerable life. He must endure the storms, must stand through the darkness, must continue to shine even when no one sees. This is his purpose, his destiny, and he begins to accept it not with resignation but with joy. He says, "And for his sake and for those like him, must I perfect myself. Therefore do I now avoid my happiness and present myself to every misfortune for my final testing and recognition." This is a remarkable statement. Zarathustra is deliberately choosing difficulty, deliberately subjecting himself to suffering and testing, not because he's masochistic, but because he knows this is how he must prepare himself for his ultimate task. He must become hard enough, strong enough, clear enough to bear witness to his teaching and to embody it in his own life. The involuntary bliss of the chapter title refers to moments of happiness, of peace, of contentment that come to him unexpectedly. These moments are tempting. They invite him to rest, to enjoy, to stop his difficult journey. But he recognizes them as distractions. He says, "Away with you, you blissful hour. With you has there come to me an involuntary bliss. Ready for my severest pain do I here stand. At the wrong time came you." This doesn't mean Zarathustra rejects happiness or joy in principle. Rather, he's saying that premature happiness, happiness that comes before his task is complete, is actually an obstacle. It makes him soft, makes him want to stop climbing, makes him forget the seriousness of what he must accomplish. So he pushes away this involuntary bliss, chooses to continue in difficulty, continues to test himself because he knows this is necessary. He's preparing himself to be able to teach eternal recurrence, to embody it, to live it fully, and this requires a strength that can only come through the hardest testing, through confronting the most severe pain, through perfecting himself beyond what seems humanly possible. The chapter ends with Zarathustra sailing on uncertain seas, still seeing no end to his journey. but now accepting this uncertainty and endlessness as part of his destiny. The meaning of eternal recurrence. Before we continue with other chapters, we need to pause and consider more deeply what eternal recurrence means and why Nietzsche considered it such a crucial idea. There are different ways to interpret this doctrine, and scholars have debated extensively about what Nietzsche really intended by it. On one level, eternal recurrence can be understood as a cosmological theory, a claim about how time and the universe actually work. If time is infinite and matter is finite, then every possible configuration must eventually repeat. This is a factual claim about the nature of reality, and whether it's true or false can be investigated scientifically, and modern physics generally rejects it, though some cyclical models of the universe bear certain similarities to it. But more importantly, eternal recurrence functions as a psychological and ethical test. Nietzsche asks, what if you were told that your life, exactly as you've lived it, would repeat infinitely? How would you react? If you would be horrified, if you would despair, if you would want to change everything, then this reveals that you're not truly affirming your life, not truly saying yes to existence as it is. You're tolerating your life, enduring it, getting through it, but not loving it, not celebrating it, not willing it fully. But if you could hear this teaching, that your life will repeat eternally, and respond with joy, if you could say, yes, I would live this life again and again and again forever, then you would have achieved the ultimate life affirmation. You would have overcome resentment, overcome the spirit of revenge, overcome the wish that things were different. You would have achieved amor fati, the love of fate, the complete acceptance and affirmation of reality exactly as it is. This connects to what Zarathustra said earlier about redemption. The will's problem is that it cannot change the past, cannot will backwards, and this creates resentment against time. But eternal recurrence offers a solution. If time is circular, if the past will come again in the future, then by willing the future you are also willing the past. By affirming, thus I willed it about everything that is and was, you overcome the impotence of the will regarding the past. Part 3. The Convalescent, the Great Longing and the Seven Seals. The Convalescent. The Convalescent is the climactic chapter where Zarathustra finally confronts his most abysmal thought head-on and nearly destroys himself in the process. The chapter opens with Zarathustra calling out to his most abysmal thought, summoning it forth. He has been circling around the doctrine of eternal recurrence, approaching it obliquely, presenting it through riddles and visions. But now he must face it directly, must speak it clearly, must fully absorb what it means. And the effect is devastating. When Zarathustra truly grasps that everything, absolutely everything, must recur eternally, he is overcome with such profound nausea that he collapses. He falls unconscious, lying as though dead. His animals, the eagle and the serpent that have accompanied him throughout his journey, are terrified that he might die. They keep watch over him, bringing him food and drink, but for 7 days Zarathustra lies there, neither eating nor drinking, barely conscious. What causes this extreme reaction? The search results tell us that Zarathustra's nausea comes specifically from the realization that if everything recurs eternally, then all the mediocrity, all the smallness, all the pettiness of humanity must also recur without end. The last man whom Zarathustra despises will return eternally. The rabble will return eternally. All the weakness, conformity, and life denial that Zarathustra has been fighting against, all of it will come back again and again and again, forever. Think about how devastating this is for someone with Zarathustra's aspirations. He has been teaching human transformation, the path to the Overman, the possibility of humanity overcoming itself and becoming something greater. But eternal recurrence seems to make all of that meaningless. If everything returns exactly as it was, then there's no real transformation, no genuine overcoming, no progress. The small man returns as the small man eternally. The great man returns as the great man eternally. Nothing changes, nothing develops, nothing improves. The eternal cycle simply repeats, indifferent to all human striving. Moreover, Zarathustra realizes that he himself must return eternally, not just his greatness and his teaching, but also his suffering, his struggles, his failures, his worst moments, and most unbearable of all, he must return to teach the doctrine of eternal recurrence eternally. He must go through this same anguish, this same confrontation with the abysmal thought, infinitely many times. He cannot escape it, cannot complete it and move on. His task is eternal, and so is his suffering. After 7 days, Zarathustra begins to recover. His animals speak to him, trying to comfort him, trying to help him make sense of his terrible insight. They tell him that the world is waiting for him like a garden, that everything wants to come to him, wants to be with him. They articulate the doctrine of eternal recurrence themselves, explaining that all things return, that the wheel of existence rolls on forever, that everything breaks apart only to come together again in the same eternal ring. But notice something important. The animals present eternal recurrence as though it were comforting, as though it were simply a beautiful cyclical pattern like the seasons. They say it cheerfully, optimistically, as though it solves problems rather than creates them. And Zarathustra recognizes that they don't truly understand what they're saying. They're like the dwarf in the earlier vision, treating eternal recurrence as an intellectual puzzle rather than an existential crisis. They haven't grasped the horror, the weight, the terrible burden of this knowledge. Yet something shifts in Zarathustra during his convalescence. He doesn't simply reject the doctrine or flee from it. Instead, he begins to find a way to affirm it. The chapter suggests that Zarathustra starts to recognize that his own existence, his own greatness, his own creative power, all of this will also return eternally. If he must return, if his life will repeat infinitely, then perhaps this gives infinite value to everything he does. Each moment of his life is not just a fleeting occurrence, but an eternal truth, something that will be affirmed again and again forever. The animals tell him something crucial. With eternal recurrence, death loses its meaning. You won't return to a new life or a better life or even a similar life. You will return to this exact same life. But this means you don't really die in any ultimate sense. You come back, you live again. The wheel turns, and everything that ever was comes around once more. This could be horrifying, but it could also be strangely comforting if you've lived well, if you've created something valuable, if you can affirm your life as it is. By the end of the chapter, Zarathustra is beginning to recover, not just physically, but spiritually. He's starting to accept his destiny as the teacher of eternal recurrence. He's beginning to see how this terrible thought might actually be the ultimate affirmation of life rather than its negation. But he's not there yet. He's still convalescent, still weak, still struggling. The full affirmation will come later. On the Great Longing. On the Great Longing, Zarathustra addresses his own soul in a beautiful and intimate passage. This chapter is more poetic, more lyrical than much of what has come before. It's as though Zarathustra, having confronted his most abysmal thought and survived it, can now speak more directly to his deepest self, can acknowledge the longing that drives all his teaching and striving. He speaks to his soul as to a beloved companion who has been with him through everything. He acknowledges how much he has given to his soul, how he has enriched it with gifts, with knowledge, with experiences. But now his soul is so full that it overflows, and it pours itself back out to him. This is the dynamic of bestowing virtue once again. You fill yourself until you overflow, and then that overflow becomes a gift that returns to you in transformed form. The great longing is for something beyond mere happiness or pleasure or even wisdom. It's a longing for eternity itself, for permanence, for the eternal return of all that is valuable and beautiful. Zarathustra is beginning to articulate a kind of love for eternal recurrence, a desire for it rather than mere acceptance of it. He wants the ring of rings, the eternal circle that brings everything back. This chapter also expresses a profound solitude. Zarathustra's soul knows things that cannot be fully communicated to others, carries burdens that cannot be shared. His great longing is something he experiences in the deepest privacy of his own being. And yet this longing is also what connects him to all of existence, because to long for eternity is to long for the eternal return of everything, not just oneself. The Other Dancing Song. Part 3 includes a chapter called The Other Dancing Song, which presents life as a dancing partner with whom Zarathustra engages in complex relationship. This is a continuation of themes from earlier in the book, where life appears as a figure, almost a goddess, with whom Zarathustra has a kind of romance. But now their relationship has deepened and become more complicated. In this dancing song, Zarathustra and life dance together, but there's tension between them. Life is changeable, unpredictable, sometimes cruel. She doesn't give herself completely or permanently. She flirts and withdraws, promises and withholds. And Zarathustra responds with both love and frustration. He desires life absolutely, wants to possess her fully, wants her to commit to him eternally. But life remains elusive, maintains her freedom, refuses to be fully captured or controlled. This dance becomes a metaphor for the human relationship with existence itself. We cannot fully control life, cannot make it conform to our desires or our plans. It slips away, changes, surprises us, sometimes delights us, and sometimes wounds us. And the question is, can we love life anyway? Can we dance with her knowing that she will never fully submit to our will, never become exactly what we want her to be? The chapter prepares us for the final affirmation that will come in the 7 seals. To truly affirm eternal recurrence, Zarathustra must affirm life as she actually is, changeable, unpredictable, sometimes painful, not life as he wishes she would be. He must love the dance itself, love the movement, love the unpredictability, rather than longing for a frozen perfect moment that could be preserved forever. The 7 seals, or the Yes and Amen song. Part 3 concludes with the 7 seals, which is Zarathustra's full ecstatic affirmation of eternal recurrence. The chapter consists of 7 stanzas, each one a hymn of praise, each one building toward the repeated refrain, "For I love you, O eternity." This is the transformation that Zarathustra has been struggling toward throughout Part 3. He began by presenting eternal recurrence as a riddle, then confronted it as an abysmal thought that nearly destroyed him, then slowly recovered and began to find ways to affirm it. Now finally he can say yes to it completely, can embrace it with joy rather than horror, can celebrate it as the ultimate expression of life affirmation. Each of the 7 seals represents a different aspect of this affirmation. In the first stanza, Zarathustra speaks of himself as a prophet walking between past and future, between 2 seas, carrying within himself the lightning that will illuminate what is coming. He is pregnant with possibilities, with the creative power to shape the future, and he loves eternity because eternity gives infinite value to this creative power. Whatever he creates will return eternally. In another stanza, Zarathustra speaks of loving the sea and all that is wild, changeable, dangerous. He has a sailor's spirit, always seeking what lies beyond the horizon, always venturing into the unknown. Space and time shimmer before him as infinite possibilities. And he loves eternity, because eternity means these possibilities never exhaust themselves. The voyage never truly ends. There is always more to discover, because everything returns and can be discovered again. In the stanza about dance and laughter, Zarathustra reveals that his virtue is like a dancer's virtue. It leaps, it moves lightly, it finds joy even in difficulty. His malice is a laughing malice that transforms evil into something beautiful through the alchemy of joy. And he loves eternity because eternity means that this dance, this laughter, this transformation of heavy things into light things will continue forever. The final stanza speaks of flying into his own heaven with his own wings, of swimming in profound distances of light, of embracing what he calls bird wisdom. This bird wisdom says there is no absolute up or down, no fixed directions or ultimate reference points. It says throw yourself about, sing rather than speak. Let yourself be carried by your own flight. Words are made for heavy things, but song is for light things. And in eternity, in the eternal return, there is infinite opportunity for this flight, this song, this freedom. Each stanza ends with the same passionate declaration, "Never yet have I found the woman by whom I should like to have children, unless it be this woman whom I love, for I love you, O eternity." Zarathustra is saying that he has never wanted to create anything lasting. never wanted to leave any legacy or produce any offspring except through his relationship with eternity herself. And eternity is accessed through the eternal return, through the willing of eternal recurrence, through saying yes to the idea that everything comes back forever. The title's reference to seals invokes the idea of sealing a covenant or a marriage. Zarathustra is wedding himself to eternity through these 7 seals. He is making an eternal commitment to eternal recurrence. He is saying that he affirms his life so completely, loves existence so fully, embraces reality so totally that he wills its eternal return. He wants this life, this world, this existence to repeat forever, and this wanting is his ultimate act of life affirmation. The higher men, the Ass Festival, and the sign. Introduction to Part 4. Part 4 of Thus Spoke Zarathustra was written later than the first 3 parts and has a somewhat different character. It's more satirical, more playful, and in some ways more personal. Zarathustra has now achieved his great teaching, the affirmation of eternal recurrence, and has returned once again to his mountain cave. But he finds himself confronted with a new challenge, dealing with those who claim to be higher men, but who are not yet the overmen he seeks. The part begins with a soothsayer visiting Zarathustra and warning him about a cry of distress from a higher man who needs help. This puts Zarathustra in a difficult position. He has been teaching hardness, teaching people to overcome pity and compassion. But now he hears that someone, potentially someone of value, a higher man, is in distress. Should he help? Is this a test of his teaching, or is it his last sin trying to seduce him? The soothsayer tells him that pity is his last sin, that he will be tempted to feel compassion for the suffering of others, even though his philosophy teaches him to overcome such feelings. Zarathustra initially resists, declaring that there are still blessed isles, still places of joy and creation, and he won't give in to pessimism or despair, but he decides to go search for this higher man, telling himself that the person is in his domain and should receive no harm from evil beasts, the higher men. As Zarathustra searches, he encounters not one, but several higher men, various types of exceptional individuals who have achieved something significant, but who remain fundamentally flawed, who have not reached the level of the Overman. These figures represent different forms of human greatness and different forms of failure. Among them are 2 kings who are disgusted with modern democracy and equality, who long for someone truly superior to rule over them. They're leading a donkey with them, which will become significant later. There's a conscientious man of spirit who has devoted himself to the study of leeches, a scholar who has narrowed his focus to an absurdly small specialization. There's a magician who represents artistic deception and self-deception. There's the ugliest man, who turns out to be the murderer of God himself. There's a voluntary beggar who has sought wisdom among the poor. And there are others, each representing a different type of higher humanity, that nevertheless falls short of the Overman. Zarathustra brings all these higher men back to his cave. He offers them hospitality, feeds them, speaks with them, but he's also disappointed by them. In a crucial speech titled On the Higher Man, he tells them directly, "You are not the ones I've been searching for. You are bridges toward the Overman. You are signs that something greater might be possible, but you yourselves are not that greater thing." What's wrong with these higher men? They're still too concerned with what others think of them, still seeking validation from the crowd, still carrying prejudices from the past. The text tells us that Zarathustra learned early on in the prologue that there's no use talking to the mob about the Overman because the mob claims everyone is equal before God. But now God is dead, and man must be overcome to create the Overman. Zarathustra gives them a series of teachings about what they must do to progress further. He tells them they must have courage, not just courage before witnesses, but hermit courage and eagle courage, which not even a god any longer beholds. They must learn to dance rather than walk lamely. They must reject the solemnity and gravity of the mob and instead embrace lightness, laughter, and joy. He even throws his laugher's crown to them, challenging them to become worthy of it. He tells them to despair rather than submit. It's better to fail magnificently while attempting something great than to succeed at living a mediocre, comfortable life. And he expresses a strange form of love for them, And verily, I love you, because you do not know how to live today, you higher men, for thus do you live best. What does this mean? He loves them precisely because they cannot fit into contemporary society, cannot adapt to the mediocrity and conformity of the age, cannot be satisfied with what satisfies the last man. The Ass Festival. After Zarathustra has spoken with the higher men and then left them alone for a while, he returns to his cave and discovers something shocking. The higher men have created a religious ceremony worshipping a donkey. This is the Ass Festival, one of the most bizarre and satirical episodes in the entire book. The higher men are all on their knees before the donkey, praying to it, offering it worship. This seems like madness. These are supposed to be higher men, people who have achieved wisdom and understanding, and yet here they are engaged in what appears to be idolatry of the most absurd kind. When Zarathustra discovers this scene, he's initially horrified and angry. Has everything he's taught them been for nothing? Have they simply reverted to the old religious instincts, creating a new god to worship because they cannot bear the absence of the old god? But the situation is more complex than it first appears. The Ass Festival is actually a parody of Christian worship. It's related to medieval festivals called the Asinaria Festa, which celebrated Jesus' childhood journey to Egypt on a donkey. The higher men aren't sincerely worshipping the donkey, they're engaging in a kind of therapeutic mockery, a carnivalesque inversion of religious ritual that helps them deal with the death of God. The ugliest man who organized this festival explains that God is killed most effectively by laughter. This is close to Zarathustra's own view. If the old religious forms have lost their power, if Christian worship has become hollow, then the best way to complete the murder of God is through mockery, through taking the power away from religious rituals, by making them ridiculous. The Ass Festival is a way of draining religious feeling of its gravity and seriousness, turning it into something that can be celebrated playfully without being taken literally. Zarathustra initially denounces their childishness. They should not be seeking to enter the kingdom of heaven, but the kingdom of earth. Otherworldly beliefs have no place in his teachings. But then he recognizes something important. These men have regained joy. They're laughing, they're playing, they're creating something together, even if it's foolish. And Zarathustra realizes that only convalescents, those who are healing from the sickness of the old values, would devise such nonsense. So he relents. He tells them they should remember this festival and celebrate it in remembrance of him. Higher men require new festivals, new rituals, new forms of celebration to replace the old religious observances, as long as they embrace the foolishness of the celebration and don't take it seriously. There's no harm in it. In fact, it serves a purpose. It marks their progression beyond sincere belief in the old God, while acknowledging that they still need some form of communal ritual and celebration. This is a profound insight into the psychological needs of human beings. We cannot simply eliminate religion and ritual and expect people to be fine without them. Even higher men, even those who have seen through the old beliefs, still feel the need for festivals, for communal celebration, for symbolic acts that bind them together. The question is whether these new festivals will affirm life or deny it, whether they'll remain earthly or become otherworldly, whether they'll be celebrated with laughter and self-awareness or with grim seriousness and self-deception. The Drunken Song. As the night deepens and approaches midnight, the festivities continue. The higher men are not ready to end their celebration, and Zarathustra joins them under the stars. This leads to one of the most important chapters in the entire book, the Drunken Song. The ugliest man says that for the first time in his life, he is satisfied with his entire existence. The others agree, and they all turn to Zarathustra in gratitude. Something has shifted in them. Through their encounter with Zarathustra, through their participation in the Ass Festival, through their conversations and celebrations, they've achieved a degree of life affirmation that they'd never reached before. And in this moment of collective joy and gratitude, Zarathustra sings to them. The song he sings is the culmination of the entire book. It returns to the themes of eternal recurrence and weaves them together with reflections on joy, sorrow, suffering, and eternity. Zarathustra speaks of midnight, the deepest, darkest time, but also the most mysterious and profound. The text quotes, "O man, take heed," and describes midnight speaking mysteriously, frightfully, and cordially. Zarathustra sings about the nature of joy and suffering. "The world is very deep," he says, "deeper than day can comprehend. It's full of deep sorrows and deep joys. Sorrow wants people to aim for something else, wants escape, wants redemption from suffering. But joy is different. Joy wants only itself, wants to continue, wants eternity. And here's the crucial insight. Because all things in the universe are intimately connected, we cannot wish for an eternity of joy without also wishing for the suffering that accompanies that joy. Everything is bound together. You cannot say yes to the good moments while saying no to the bad ones because they're all part of the same fabric of existence. If you want eternal joy, you must also accept eternal suffering. If you want the peaks, you must also accept the valleys. If you affirm life, you must affirm all of it, not just the parts you like. The song contains the line, "Joy wants the eternity of all things." This is the ultimate expression of amor fati, the love of fate. Joy doesn't just want itself to continue. It wants everything to continue, everything to return, everything to be affirmed eternally. This is what it means to truly affirm eternal recurrence, not just accepting that everything repeats, but actively willing it, desiring it, celebrating it. During this song, something remarkable happens to Zarathustra himself. When the ugliest man expresses his complete satisfaction with life, Zarathustra stands there like one drunken, his glance dulled, his tongue faltered and his feet staggered. He's overwhelmed by emotion, by the realization that these higher men, flawed as they are, have actually understood something essential, have actually achieved a degree of life affirmation. The text describes Zarathustra's spirit retreating and fleeing into remote distances, wandering on high mountain ridges between two seas. He's experiencing a kind of ecstasy, a moment of transcendence where he sees the full significance of what's happening. These men have moved beyond their previous sickness, have overcome their resentment and life denial, have said yes to existence. Part 4, Conclusion. The sign and beginning critical engagement. The sign. The morning after the drunken song, Zarathustra rises and steps outside his cave. His guests, the higher men, are still sleeping inside. He greets the rising sun once more, just as he did at the very beginning of the book when he first left his mountain to descend to humanity. This parallel is intentional. The book ends as it began, with Zarathustra facing the sun at dawn, but everything has changed. As Zarathustra walks along the mountain with his eagle and serpent, something extraordinary happens. He finds himself surrounded by birds, so thick that he must push them away. When he extends his hand, it lands on something unexpected, a thick, warm mane. He hears a roar in front of him, a soft, long lion roar. A lion has appeared outside his cave, and with the lion comes a flock of doves. Zarathustra immediately recognizes this as the sign he has been waiting for. Remember the chapter on the 3 Metamorphoses from the very beginning of the book. The spirit must first become a camel, bearing burdens. Then it must become a lion, fighting the dragon and winning its freedom. Finally, it must become a child, the innocent creator. The appearance of the lion signals that the transformation is continuing, that the children, those who will become true creators, true overmen, are near. Zarathustra declares, "My children are near, my children." He understands that his real work is not with the higher men sleeping in his cave. They are bridges, they are signs, they are steps along the way. But they themselves are not the overmen he seeks. His true children, those who will fully embody his teaching, who will genuinely overcome themselves and become something new, are coming, even if they haven't arrived yet. And in this moment, Zarathustra realizes something crucial about himself. He has overcome his final sin. The soothsayer had warned him that pity would be his last temptation, his ultimate weakness. And indeed, when he gathered the higher men into his cave, when he felt compassion for their suffering and their limitations, when he tried to help them and teach them, all of this was an expression of pity. But now he understands that his pity for the higher men was holding him back, was preventing him from pursuing his true work. He must let go of them. He must stop trying to save or improve those who are merely higher, but not yet highest. His task is not to rescue the higher men, but to prepare the way for the overmen, for those who will be genuinely new. As the text says, Zarathustra realizes that even though he had pity on these higher men, he can now put his sin behind him. Now he truly knows the way to teach the one who can rise above the higher men. When the higher men emerge from the cave and see the lion, they cry out in fear and flee. This reaction itself demonstrates that they are not yet what Zarathustra needs them to be. They fear the lion, fear the symbol of the will to power and self-overcoming. They're still too timid, still too comfortable, still seeking safety rather than embracing the danger and difficulty of genuine transformation. Their cry of distress reminds Zarathustra of the soothsayer's prediction that he would hear a cry and be tempted by compassion for the higher man. But this time, he doesn't respond to their fear with pity. He doesn't rush to comfort them or protect them. Instead, he realizes that this temptation is over, that he has moved beyond it. The text tells us that from this time forward, he will think of nothing but his work. The book ends with Zarathustra preparing to descend once more, but this time with full clarity about his mission. He's no longer burdened by pity or compassion for those who cannot rise to his teaching. He's no longer trying to speak to everyone or to save the higher men. Instead, he's focused entirely on his true work, preparing the way for the overmen, for his children, for those who will genuinely transcend current humanity. The lion and the doves are his sign that this work can now truly begin. The transformation he has been teaching is not just possible in theory, it's actually happening or will happen. His children are near, the overmen are coming. And Zarathustra, having overcome all his sins, including the final one of pity, is ready to be their prophet, their teacher, their forerunner. The book doesn't give us the overmen. It doesn't show us Zarathustra successfully creating these new human beings. Instead, it ends with promise, with anticipation, with the sign that something is about to happen. This open ending is perfect for Nietzsche's purposes. The overman is not something that can be simply described or definitively portrayed. It's a future possibility, a direction, a goal toward which humanity might strive. And the book's role is not to deliver the overman, but to prepare readers for that possibility, to challenge us to begin our own transformation, to inspire us to overcome ourselves. Critical engagement, scholarly interpretations and critiques. Now that we've worked through the entire narrative and philosophical content of The Spoke Zarathustra, we need to step back and examine how scholars, critics, and philosophers have engaged with this text over the past century and more. The book has generated an enormous range of interpretations, both sympathetic and critical, and understanding these various readings can deepen our appreciation of its complexity and significance. One of the first things to acknowledge is that Thus Spoke Zarathustra is an exceptionally difficult text. Unlike Nietzsche's other philosophical works, which are often written in aphoristic but relatively straightforward prose, Zarathustra is deliberately poetic, symbolic, and ambiguous. This creates challenges for both translators and interpreters. As one source notes, translators struggle with knowing whether he has even approximated what Nietzsche meant from one passage to the next. And if the translator isn't sure what's meant, readers are even more challenged. Some critics have argued that the book is actually a failure, at least as a work of philosophy. Robert Pippin, in an introduction to a Cambridge edition, describes it as, in large part, a failure. These critics typically argue that Zarathustra is overblown, laborious to get through, and beyond these perceived aesthetic flaws, lacking in philosophical quality. From this perspective, the book's poetic and symbolic style obscures rather than illuminates its philosophical content, and the same ideas could have been expressed more clearly in straightforward prose. However, many other scholars vigorously defend the book's literary form and argue that its philosophical content cannot be separated from its poetic expression. As one academic analysis puts it, the book engages readers at a deep archetypal level, while its parodic function works to subvert the well-worn paths of our drives to meaning towards sacred transcendence and deflects them towards investing a godless existence without meaning or goal. In other words, the form itself is part of the philosophy. Nietzsche is not just presenting ideas but transforming how we think, using literary techniques to bypass our rational defenses and speak to deeper levels of consciousness. Distinguished scholars who have written substantial interpretations of Zarathustra include Carl Jung, who analyzed the book from a psychological perspective, examining its archetypal patterns and symbols. Lawrence Lampert has written extensive philosophical commentary exploring the book's structure and arguments. Kathleen Higgins has examined its musical and poetic dimensions. Stanley Rosen, Robert Gooding Williams, and Thomas Young have all produced major scholarly works on the text. Each of these scholars brings different interpretive frameworks to the book, finding in it different emphases and meanings. A major area of scholarly debate concerns the concept of eternal recurrence. Some scholars interpret it primarily as a cosmological theory, a literal claim about how time and the universe function. Others see it as essentially a psychological or ethical thought experiment, a test of life affirmation that isn't meant to be taken as literal truth about physical reality. Still others argue that Nietzsche deliberately left this ambiguous, that he wanted readers to struggle with whether eternal recurrence is meant literally or figuratively, because that struggle itself is philosophically productive. The Übermensch concept has been even more controversial and problematic. As one source explicitly notes, Nazis exploited Nietzsche's work to justify nationalist and anti-Semitic ideologies in their own right, even though Nietzsche himself was anti-nationalist and anti-Semitic. This is one of the great tragedies of the book's reception history. The Nazis distorted the concept of the Übermensch to support their ideology of Aryan racial superiority, when Nietzsche's actual concept was about individual self-overcoming and had nothing to do with race or nationality. Nietzsche himself despised nationalism, despised anti-Semitism, and would have been horrified by how his work was misused. Major philosophical objections and critiques. Modern scholars have identified several significant philosophical problems in Nietzsche's work, particularly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. One of the most fundamental criticisms concerns the internal consistency of his philosophy. Critics point out that Nietzsche challenges the very notion of absolute truth, claiming that all concepts are merely human constructions and that truth is what affirms life. Yet he simultaneously presents ideas like the will to power and eternal recurrence as if they were truths about reality. This creates what critics call a circular problem. If objective truths don't exist, then Nietzsche's own theories are also just subjective constructs with no special claim to validity. This epistemological problem runs throughout the work. Nietzsche maintains that truth is merely a viewpoint and that no objective reality exists. But if this is true, then the will to power is also just a subjective construct, essentially an arbitrary assertion. His reasoning becomes circular. He dismisses absolute truths, yet makes sweeping claims about life's nature, human psychology, and the structure of existence. Some critics argue that he fails to provide a genuine alternative to nihilism, offering only what they characterize as psychological tricks rather than a philosophically coherent system. Another major area of critique concerns Nietzsche's methodology. He intentionally avoids systematic philosophy, favoring a style rich in aphorisms and poetic passages. His ideas often appear scattered and disjointed, making it difficult to trace coherent arguments. Rather than laying out logical premises followed by conclusions, he tends to offer sharp statements that seem isolated from one another. While defenders argue this is intentional and philosophically productive, critics maintain that this lack of defined structure complicates analysis and makes it unclear what Nietzsche is actually claiming. The concept of the Übermensch has faced particular scrutiny. Some scholars argue that Nietzsche never adequately explains what the Übermensch would actually be like, leaving it as an empty ideal that inspires without guiding. Others point out the dangerous potential for misinterpretation, as evidenced by the Nazi appropriation of the concept. While Nietzsche himself was anti-nationalist and opposed to anti-Semitism, his language of overcoming mastery and the creation of higher types proved dangerously malleable in the hands of ideologues looking to justify oppression. The critique of compassion and pity has also generated significant philosophical pushback. Moral philosophers have argued that Nietzsche's dismissal of compassion is both psychologically unrealistic and ethically problematic. Some scholars contend that his analysis of compassion as disguised weakness or resentment fails to account for genuine forms of empathy and care that don't involve condescension or power dynamics. The Harvard analysis notes that while Nietzsche makes important observations about how compassion can function as a form of moral control, his wholesale rejection of sympathy may overlook its legitimate role in human flourishing. There's also debate about whether Nietzsche adequately addresses the challenge of nihilism that he himself identifies. Having declared God dead and traditional values bankrupt, does he really offer a viable alternative? Or does his philosophy of self-creation and will to power simply mask the underlying meaninglessness with heroic gestures? Critics from religious and traditional perspectives argue that human beings cannot actually create values ex nihilo, that we need some grounding beyond mere individual will, and that Nietzsche's solution is psychologically unsustainable for most people. Nietzsche's influence on contemporary thought. Despite these critiques, or perhaps partly because of them, Nietzsche's influence on modern and contemporary philosophy has been enormous. He is widely recognized as a precursor to postmodernism, having anticipated many of its central themes. His critique of objective truth, his emphasis on perspective and interpretation, his genealogical method of tracing the origins of values, all of these have become foundational to postmodern thought. Habermas has argued for Nietzsche as a turning point into postmodernity, noting that he renounces a renewed revision of the concept of reason and bids farewell to the dialectic of enlightenment. Unlike earlier critics of Enlightenment rationality who sought to reform or improve reason, Nietzsche fundamentally questions whether reason as traditionally conceived can provide the foundation for human values and meaning that the Enlightenment promised. In existentialist philosophy, Nietzsche's influence is equally profound. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus built upon Nietzsche's insight that we must create our own meaning in a universe without inherent purpose. The existentialist emphasis on radical freedom, on taking responsibility for one's choices, on the burden and possibility of self-creation, all of these echo Nietzschean themes from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Martin Heidegger, though critical of aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy, engaged deeply with his work and acknowledged its importance for understanding the modern condition. Contemporary relevance and applications. The relevance of Thus Spoke Zarathustra to our contemporary world is striking. As one recent analysis puts it, while rooted in the context of late 19th century Europe, Thus Spoke Zarathustra continues to resonate powerfully in contemporary discourse. In a world marked by rapid technological changes, the decline of traditional values, existential crises, and widespread political and ideological fragmentation, Nietzsche's work addresses themes that are arguably more relevant today than ever. The death of God proclamation speaks directly to our secular age. In the contemporary world, Nietzsche's prophecy seems even more relevant than it did in his own time. The postmodern era has witnessed the collapse of many grand narratives, not only religion, but also political ideologies, social norms, and cultural traditions that once provided individuals with a sense of place and purpose. The rise of secularism, coupled with globalized capitalism, has left many feeling alienated and untethered. Increasingly, people seek meaning through individual experience, consumerism, or digital interactions, yet these often feel hollow in the face of larger existential questions. The concept of the Übermensch offers what one scholar calls a provocative response to modern challenges. In a world where individuals often feel powerless in the face of global systems, whether political, economic, or technological, the Übermensch represents the potential for personal agency and transformation. In the age of social media, identity politics, and widespread conformity, Nietzsche's call to create one's own values and live authentically resounds with urgency. Consider how social media has created new forms of conformity and new mechanisms for the herd mentality that Nietzsche criticized. Algorithms determine what content we see, creating echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs. The pressure to perform a curated identity for public consumption generates a new kind of inauthenticity. The constant comparison with others fosters resentment, and the kind of leveling tendency that Nietzsche associated with the last man. In this context, Zarathustra's teaching about self-creation, about having the courage to stand apart from the crowd, about developing one's own values rather than accepting mass-produced identities, feels remarkably prescient. The critique of pity and compassion also has contemporary applications, though they must be handled carefully. In an age of virtue signaling and performative activism, where displays of compassion can function more as social status markers than as genuine care, Nietzsche's skepticism about motives behind moral actions deserves consideration. His warning against the merciful ones whose bliss is in their pity speaks to how helping others can become a form of self-satisfaction that actually perpetuates dependency and inequality. However, this critique must be balanced against the genuine need for empathy and social solidarity in addressing systemic problems. The will to power concept has been applied in various contemporary contexts. In psychology, it resonates with theories about motivation, achievement, and self-actualization. In social theory, it offers insights into how power operates not just through overt coercion, but through the creation and enforcement of values and norms. In personal development contexts, it has been interpreted as a call to take charge of one's life, to stop being passive, to actively create rather than merely react. Eternal recurrence as a thought experiment remains philosophically and existentially challenging. If you were told that your life, exactly as you've lived it, would repeat infinitely, how would you respond? This question can serve as a powerful tool for self-examination and life evaluation. It forces us to ask, am I living in a way that I could affirm eternally? Are there aspects of my life I would change if I truly took responsibility for them? The thought experiment cuts through rationalization and forces radical honesty about whether we're genuinely affirming our existence or merely tolerating it. Nietzsche's critique of the state as the coldest of all cold monsters resonates in an era of expanding surveillance, growing bureaucracy, and increasing governmental reach into private life. His warnings about how the state homogenizes individuals, destroys genuine community, and creates conformity speak to contemporary concerns about the relationship between individual freedom and collective order. At the same time, his aristocratic disdain for democracy and equality must be critically examined in light of the genuine achievements of democratic movements in expanding rights and opportunities. The book's emphasis on self-overcoming has profound implications for how we think about personal development, education, and human potential. Rather than seeing ourselves as fixed entities with inherent natures that must be accepted, Nietzsche encourages us to see ourselves as perpetual works in progress, always capable of transformation. This aligns with contemporary research in neuroplasticity, growth mindset, and developmental psychology, all of which emphasize human capacity for change. Nietzsche's influence on psychology and psychotherapy. Perhaps nowhere is Nietzsche's contemporary relevance more evident than in the field of psychology and psychotherapy. His influence on existential therapy and psychoanalysis has been profound and lasting. Carl Jung himself considered Thus Spoke Zarathustra to be a powerful metaphor for self-realization, and the book significantly shaped his theory of individuation, the psychological process of integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality to achieve wholeness. Nietzsche's philosophy directly addresses existential and spiritual concerns that clients bring to therapy. His emphasis on confronting and embracing existential challenges as a means of personal growth resonates deeply with contemporary existential therapeutic approaches. The concept of self-overcoming, central to Zarathustra, aligns with the therapeutic goal of self-actualization, the continual process of becoming one's truest, most authentic self. Therapists influenced by Nietzsche help individuals break free from societal expectations, past traumas, and self-imposed limitations, encouraging them to embrace their power to shape their own destiny. One of the most therapeutically relevant aspects of Nietzsche's thought is his reframing of suffering. Rather than viewing suffering as something to be eliminated or avoided at all costs, Nietzsche saw it as potentially transformative, as the crucible in which strength and character are forged. This perspective has been incorporated into various therapeutic modalities that help clients find meaning in difficult experiences rather than simply trying to escape them. Existential therapy in particular draws on Nietzsche's insight that what does not kill me makes me stronger, helping individuals understand how adversity can contribute to growth and resilience. The concept of personal responsibility is another area where Nietzsche's philosophy deeply influences therapeutic practice. Nietzsche rejected the notion of a predetermined or externally dictated life, instead advocating for individuals to create their own values and meaning. This requires taking full responsibility for one's actions and decisions without relying on external authorities to define one's path. In therapy, this translates to helping clients move from a victim mentality, where they see themselves as passive recipients of circumstances, to an agent mentality, where they recognize their capacity to choose how they respond to situations and create meaning from their experiences. The Death of God proclamation addresses what many clients experience as a profound crisis of meaning in secular modernity. Without the framework of traditional religion or morality, individuals must become creators of their own values. Existential therapy, shaped by Nietzsche's insights, helps individuals confront this challenge and discover their capacity for meaning-making even in the absence of absolute or divinely ordained truths. The will to power, when properly understood, offers therapeutic insights into human motivation and growth. Rather than interpreting it as a desire to dominate others, therapists recognize it as the fundamental drive towards self-expansion, competence, and the overcoming of limitations. This aligns with contemporary positive psychology's emphasis on growth, mastery, and the development of human potential. Helping clients recognize and channel their will to power productively becomes a therapeutic goal, redirecting energy that might be expressed destructively toward creative self-transformation. Even the concept of eternal recurrence finds therapeutic application. Used as a thought experiment, it becomes a powerful tool for helping clients evaluate whether they're living authentically. The therapist might ask, if you had to live your life exactly as it is now, over and over forever, would you be satisfied? What would you change? What prevents you from making those changes now? This forces clients to confront whether they're truly affirming their lives or merely tolerating them, whether they're living according to their own values or simply conforming to external expectations. Cultural criticism in contemporary society. Nietzsche's critique of modern culture remains remarkably relevant to understanding contemporary society. His analysis of cultural disintegration, the proliferation of information without integration, and the alienation of modern individuals speaks directly to our current situation. In his critique of Western society for its lack of genuine culture, Nietzsche argued that modern society possesses particular customs, artworks, and practices, but lacks what he called a unified artistic culture, an integrated way of life where individuals can be privately what they are considered to be socially. This observation about the incongruence between inner experience and outer presentation has become even more pronounced in the age of social media. Nietzsche identified dissimulation and convention as signs of cultural disintegration, noting that culture had lost its ability to integrate the individual within the social sphere. Modern individuals, he observed, constantly hide behind masks, creating an interior without an equivalent exterior. This analysis prefigures contemporary concerns about authenticity in an age where people curate online personas that may bear little resemblance to their actual lives and experiences. Nietzsche's critique of the educational system and mass media as responsible for cultural absence also resonates powerfully today. He argued that the overabundance of information leads people to categorize and discard knowledge rather than actualize it and relate it to life. In section 4 of his second untimely meditation, Nietzsche identified the educational system as the primary culprit, later adding mass media. This analysis seems prophetic given our current information age, where we're bombarded with more data than ever but often struggle to synthesize it into meaningful understanding or to apply it to living well. The concept of the last man becomes particularly relevant when examining contemporary consumer culture. The last man wants comfort, entertainment, security, precisely what modern capitalism promises to provide. The proliferation of technologies designed to eliminate discomfort, the emphasis on safety and risk avoidance, the focus on pleasant distractions and entertainment, all of these align disturbingly well with Nietzsche's prophecy about where humanity might be heading if it doesn't embrace the challenge of self-overcoming. His critique of equality and democracy, while controversial, offers insights into certain pathologies of contemporary political culture. The emphasis on equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity, the tendency to celebrate mediocrity and view excellence with suspicion, the pressure to conform to group consensus. These phenomena illustrate what Nietzsche feared about the leveling tendency of modern democratic culture. However, this critique must be carefully distinguished from reactionary politics. Nietzsche's concern was not with political democracy per se, but with the cultural tendency toward conformity and the suppression of individual excellence. Literary and artistic influence. The impact of Thus Spoke Zarathustra extends far beyond philosophy into literature and art. The book's dramatic, poetic style and its unapologetic exploration of contradictions influenced major literary figures. Franz Kafka's alienated protagonists struggling against incomprehensible systems echo Nietzschean themes. Thomas Mann engaged deeply with Nietzsche's ideas throughout his work, particularly in novels like Dr. Faustus. James Joyce's experimental style and his exploration of consciousness show Nietzsche's influence. The book's structure as a philosophical narrative, combining ideas with story, parable with argument, has inspired countless writers to experiment with hybrid forms that blur the boundaries between philosophy and literature. Its prophetic tone and visionary quality influenced the development of modernist literature's emphasis on subjective experience and radical experimentation with form. In visual arts, the Übermensch concept and Nietzsche's emphasis on creativity and self-overcoming influenced expressionist and other avant-garde movements. Artists drawn to Nietzsche saw in his work a justification for breaking with tradition, for creating radical new forms, for asserting the artist's visionary role in cultural transformation. The book's enduring power. What explains the continued fascination with Thus Spoke Zarathustra more than 140 years after its publication? Several factors contribute to its enduring power. First, it addresses fundamental questions that remain urgent. How do we create meaning in a secular age? What does human excellence look like? How can we avoid descent into nihilism or comfortable mediocrity? These are not just historical questions, but live concerns for anyone thoughtfully engaging with contemporary existence. Second, the book refuses easy answers. It doesn't provide a systematic philosophy that can be neatly summarized and applied. Instead, it challenges readers to think for themselves, to struggle with difficult ideas, to create their own interpretations. This open-ended quality makes it perpetually relevant because each generation, each reader, must grapple with it anew. Third, the poetic and symbolic nature of the text gives it a depth that purely argumentative philosophy often lacks. The symbols, the mountain, the sun, the eagle and serpent, the tightrope walker, the gateway-marked moment resonate at multiple levels of meaning. They speak not just to our rational intellect, but to our imagination and our deepest existential concerns. Fourth, the book embodies a rare combination of profound seriousness about ultimate questions with moments of playfulness, humor, and even absurdity. The Ass Festival, for instance, shows that confronting meaninglessness doesn't require grim solemnity. It can be done with laughter and creative play. This balance between profundity and levity makes the book more psychologically realistic than purely earnest philosophical works. Finally, Thus Spoke Zarathustra remains relevant because the problems Nietzsche diagnosed have not been solved. In many ways, they've intensified. The crisis of meaning in post-religious society, the challenges of creating authentic values, the tension between individual excellence and social equality, the temptation of comfortable mediocrity, all of these remain pressing concerns. And Nietzsche's responses to these challenges, however controversial or incomplete, continue to provoke and inspire. Recapping the central arguments, as we reach the conclusion of this comprehensive exploration of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it's essential to draw together the major philosophical threads that run throughout this complex and challenging work. At its core, this book addresses what Nietzsche saw as the central crisis of modern civilization: the death of God and the collapse of traditional values, and the question of how humanity can create meaning in the absence of these foundational beliefs. The book's opening proclamation, "God is dead," is not simply an announcement of atheism, but a diagnosis of cultural and spiritual crisis. Nietzsche recognized that the decline of Christianity and traditional religious belief had removed the foundation upon which Western civilization had built its understanding of truth, morality, and meaning. but rather than despairing at this loss, Zarathustra presents it as an opportunity, perhaps the greatest opportunity in human history, the chance for humanity to overcome itself and become something greater. This leads directly to the book's most famous concept, the Übermensch or Overman. The Übermensch represents Nietzsche's vision of what humanity might become if it successfully navigates the crisis of meaninglessness. This is not a fixed endpoint, but a direction, a constant process of self-overcoming and transformation. The three Metamorphoses, camel to lion to child, provide the developmental framework, first discipline and burden-bearing, then rebellion and liberation, finally innocent creativity and joyful affirmation. The Übermensch is not simply a stronger or smarter human being, but someone who has learned to create their own values, to affirm existence without needing external validation or transcendent justification. The will to power emerges as the fundamental drive underlying all life and all human striving. Properly understood, this is not primarily about dominating others, but about the drive to grow, to expand one's capacities, to overcome limitations and obstacles. Life itself is characterized by this perpetual striving to overcome itself, which is why nothing remains static or fixed. Even our understanding of truth, morality, and meaning must be constantly re-examined and transformed through the exercise of the creative will. Eternal recurrence stands as perhaps the book's most philosophically profound and psychologically demanding idea. Whether understood as a cosmological theory or as an ethical thought experiment, it demands the ultimate form of life affirmation, the willingness to will the eternal return of all things, including all suffering, all failure, all that we wish were different. Only someone who has genuinely overcome resentment, who has learned to love fate, amor fati, who can say yes to existence exactly as it is, only such a person can affirm eternal recurrence without horror. This becomes the ultimate test of whether we truly affirm life or merely tolerate it. The book's sustained critique of traditional morality runs throughout all four parts. Zarathustra challenges the Christian values of pity, humility, selflessness, and otherworldly orientation. He argues these values emerge from weakness and resentment rather than strength and affirmation, that they represent a denial of life rather than its celebration. In their place, he proposes values grounded in earthly existence, in strength, in joy, in creative self-expression. His famous imperative, "Remain faithful to the earth," encapsulates this fundamental reorientation from transcendent to immanent, from otherworldly to this-worldly, from life-denying to life-affirming values. The lasting legacy. More than 140 years after its publication, Thus Spoke Zarathustra remains one of philosophy's most influential and controversial works. Its impact extends far beyond academic philosophy into psychology, literature, art, and popular culture. The book's central concepts, the death of God, the Übermensch, the will to power, eternal recurrence, have become part of our cultural vocabulary, even when misunderstood or misapplied. The book's greatest contribution may be its diagnosis of modernity's spiritual crisis and its attempt to chart a path beyond nihilism without retreating to traditional religious or metaphysical certainties. Nietzsche understood that the collapse of traditional values would not simply leave us in a neutral state, but would create a void that could be filled either by creative life affirmation or by various forms of nihilism and despair. His attempt to articulate a philosophy that fully embraces earthly existence without transcendent justifications remains one of the most ambitious projects in Western thought. The existentialist movement drew heavily on Nietzsche's themes of radical freedom, the necessity of self-creation, and the burden of responsibility in a universe without inherent meaning. Thinkers like Sartre, Camus, and Heidegger all engaged deeply with Nietzschean ideas, even when they disagreed with specific aspects of his philosophy. The existentialist emphasis on authenticity, on living in accordance with one's own chosen values, rather than conforming to social expectations, echoes Zarathustra's teaching throughout. In psychology and psychotherapy, Nietzsche's influence has been profound. His insights into motivation, self-deception, the role of unconscious drives, and the possibilities for self-transformation have shaped existential therapy, humanistic psychology, and various other therapeutic approaches. His reframing of suffering as potentially transformative rather than merely negative has helped therapists assist clients in finding meaning in difficult experiences. The book's literary influence can hardly be overstated. Its hybrid form, combining philosophical discourse with narrative, parable, poetry, and prophecy, opened new possibilities for how philosophy could be expressed. Its symbolic richness and dramatic intensity influenced modernist and postmodernist literature, demonstrating that profound philosophical ideas could be conveyed through literary art rather than systematic argument. Key takeaways for contemporary readers. What should readers in the 21st century take from Thus Spoke Zarathustra? What does this difficult, challenging, sometimes troubling book offer to those grappling with contemporary life? First, the book challenges us to examine whether we're living authentically or merely conforming to external expectations. In an age of social media, performative identity, and constant comparison with others, Zarathustra's call to create your own values and live according to your own standards feels urgently relevant. Are you living the life you would will to repeat eternally? Or are you merely going through the motions, following paths laid out by others? Second, the book offers a framework for thinking about personal development and transformation. The three Metamorphoses provide a map: the discipline to build strength, the courage to break free from external authority, and the creativity to generate something genuinely new. Growth requires all three stages, and recognizing which stage you're in can help you understand what you need to focus on next. Third, Nietzsche's critique of victimhood and his emphasis on taking responsibility for your life remains powerful. While we must acknowledge real constraints and injustices, the book asks whether we're using these as excuses to avoid taking action where action is possible. The will to power, properly understood, is the drive to overcome obstacles and expand our capacities. It's about what we can do rather than complaining about what's been done to us. Fourth, the book invites us to reconsider our relationship with suffering. Rather than viewing difficulty as something to be eliminated at all costs, might we see it as necessary for growth and meaning? This doesn't mean seeking suffering or romanticizing hardship, but it does mean recognizing that a life worth living will involve challenges, setbacks, and pain, and that these experiences can contribute to who we become. Fifth, Zarathustra's teaching about eternal recurrence offers a powerful tool for self-examination. The question, "Would you will the eternal return of your life exactly as it is?" cuts through rationalization and self-deception. It forces us to confront whether we're genuinely affirming our choices or merely tolerating them, whether we're living with purpose or drifting, whether we're creating the life we want or settling for less. Sixth, the book challenges our assumptions about morality and values. It asks us to examine where our moral beliefs come from, whether they serve life or deny it, whether they emerge from strength or weakness. This doesn't mean abandoning ethics, but rather taking responsibility for ethical thinking, creating values that affirm life and human flourishing rather than simply accepting inherited rules. Seventh, the critique of pity and compassion, while controversial, offers insights into the psychology of helping relationships. It asks us to examine our motives when we help others. Are we genuinely serving them, or are we satisfying our own needs for validation and moral superiority? Are we empowering others or creating dependency? These are uncomfortable questions, but important ones. Eighth, the book's emphasis on joy, laughter, and dance, on lightness rather than heaviness, reminds us that profundity doesn't require solemnity. The ability to laugh at ourselves, to approach even serious matters with a certain playfulness, is a sign of strength rather than frivolity. Life affirmation includes celebrating existence, not just grimly enduring it. Final reflections. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is not an easy book to read, to understand, or to apply. It challenges many of our deepest assumptions about meaning, morality, and human purpose. It offers no comforting certainties, no simple solutions, no guaranteed paths to happiness. Instead, it demands that we think for ourselves, that we take responsibility for creating our own values, that we face the difficulty and uncertainty of existence without illusions. The book's greatest strength is also its greatest challenge. It refuses to do the work for us. Zarathustra doesn't provide a moral system to follow, a set of rules to obey, or a clear picture of what the Übermensch would look like. Instead, he offers direction, inspiration, provocation. He challenges us to begin our own process of transformation, to undertake our own journey towards self-overcoming. The specifics must be worked out by each individual in their own way. This can be frustrating for readers seeking clear guidance or systematic philosophy. But it's also liberating because it means the book trusts us. Trusts that we have the capacity to think, to create, to transform ourselves. It treats us not as followers who need instruction, but as potential collaborators in the project of human self-overcoming. Whether you accept Nietzsche's specific doctrines or not, whether you find his vision inspiring or troubling, Thus Spoke Zarathustra remains a work of extraordinary power and relevance. It addresses questions that every thoughtful person must confront. How do we create meaning in a world without absolute truths? How do we develop authentic values in a culture that pressures conformity? How do we affirm life fully, with all its suffering and uncertainty? How do we become who we truly are rather than who others expect us to be? These questions have no final answers, but they demand to be asked. And in asking them with such intensity, poetry, and philosophical depth, Nietzsche created a work that continues to challenge, provoke, and inspire, more than a century after its creation. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is not just a historical artifact, but a living philosophical text that speaks to our contemporary condition with undiminished urgency. The book ends with Zarathustra receiving his sign, the lion and the doves, and preparing to descend once more to begin his true work. It's an open ending, full of promise and possibility, but offering no closure. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The work of human transformation, of creating new values, of becoming the Overman, this work is never finished. Each generation, each individual, must undertake it anew. Zarathustra doesn't deliver the Overman to us. He challenges us to begin becoming Overmen ourselves. This has been a journey through one of philosophy's most profound and challenging texts. If this exploration has provoked you to think differently, to question your assumptions, to consider new possibilities for your own life and thought, then it has served its purpose. And if you find yourself returning to the book itself, wrestling with its ideas, making them your own, then you've begun the journey that Zarathustra himself prescribes. The mountain is calling, the path lies before you, and the transformation begins with a single step into the unknown.